Welcome to your Half Moon Bay Planning Commission meeting. It's great to have you here. I've just been reminded, and I will remind everyone who speaks tonight to work hard to speak into the microphones. And if you can't hear, raise your hand or shout or throw something, and we'll make sure we get heard. So with that, we are ready. Let's begin with a Pledge of Allegiance, please. Thank you. Could we please have a roll call, Bridget?
Yes. Commissioner Hernandez?
I am present.
Commissioner Hernandez is teleconferencing from Las Vegas for a business trip. But Commissioner Polgar? Here. Commissioner Ruddick?
I'm here.
Vice Chair Benjamin?
Here.
And Commissioner Holt is also absent this evening.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry to hear that you're having such a rough time in Las Vegas, Rick. So the first item on our agenda is a review and approval of the minutes of the meeting of January the 9th. That was our last meeting. Do any of the members have a comment? Yes, Commissioner Polgar.
Yeah, I just had a comment regarding the discussion of the item, I guess let's say, for the Harbor District. I thought that I had brought up the comments about having trash recycling and compost and kind of emphasizing the importance of having all of those facilities, and I didn't see that in the notes, reflected in the notes. And to me, it's a very important consideration for this development.
So we'd recommend that you go ahead and make a motion to revise the notes to include that, but I do want to reassure you it did get put into the conditions of approval.
Okay, thank you very much. Anything else, Commissioner Polgar? Commissioner Reddick? If not, could I have a motion?
I'll move to approve the minutes with the addition of the note about trash recycling and compost.
Very good. Is there a second?
I second it.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. Okay, great. That is all the minutes we have for tonight. The next item on our agenda is the public comment. This is a time for anyone here tonight who would like to address the Planning Commission on an item which is not on our agenda to come to the podium and share your thoughts with us. At the moment, I don't have any green cards that suggest that. The ones I see are related to items that are on the agenda. So if there are none, I will open and close the public comment period. And that brings us to the first item on a study session agenda for tonight, and that is the Carter Memorial Park renovation project. And I believe this item is Scott's. Good evening.
Thank you, Vice Chair and members of the Planning Commission. This item includes a study session on park improvements to John L. Carter Park, a city park. And note that the improvements to the Carter Park presented tonight in part of partially the implementation of the Parks Master Plan that the Planning Commission was heavily involved with, changes and feedback before it was adopted by the City Council. And the primary reason for this study session is to introduce the project to the Planning Commission in advance of the Commission's role to review the coastal development permit that is required for the park improvements, as well as the associated CEQA review. This project will come back to the Planning Commission at a future date. And one thing to note, we did receive a last-minute letter from the Shakespeare Company in support of the project, and I provided a copy to the Vice Chair for circulation.
Is there a copy out there for the public as well?
Not to my knowledge. So, okay. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mark Schatz of ELS Architecture, who was hired by the city as the project architect. Mark will present the project, and once he's finished, the Planning Commission is welcome to ask any clarifying questions of staff or Mark, take public comment, and provide feedback to staff on this exciting project.
It's on. Isn't
It's on.
it? Okay. Oh, now I'm very
That's
loud.
good.
Well, thank you very much. I'm here tonight, as you heard, to talk about our proposed project for Carter Park. This project was an important part of the Half Moon Bay Parks Master Plan that was approved by council at the end of last year. And as Scott mentioned, this commission had a lot of input along the way in that master plan. The vision for Carter Park was to create a more active cultural events park, but also to give it more activation during the day. And the main components of that are a new permanent stage, a permanent seating venue like an amphitheater with an improved lawn seating area, and then improved lighting and signage, the appropriate level of habitat protection, and a better connection to Main Street, because a lot of people right now say, where's Carter Park? They don't know, they can't identify it from the street. We've gone through an extensive community outreach process for the project already. This began when we did the first concept plan at the end of last year. That was presented in September with some boards at the Summer's End Music Festival, and we got a lot of enthusiastic response to it at that presentation. And then that concept plan was presented to the Park and Recreation Commission at a community workshop that was held in November of 2018. Again, met with a lot of positive support. When we restarted the project this year, the first thing we wanted to do was really garner some additional input, both from the community at large and from people most impacted by the project, which would be the immediate neighbors of the site and the representatives of the performing arts organizations that would be using the site for their performances. So we held 2 focus groups on June, oh, the date's left, it doesn't matter, in early June, and one was with representatives of the performing arts groups, including a couple groups that aren't currently using this site as their venue, but who are very interested in using it once it's enhanced. And then we met with the neighbors from the Homeowners Association at the Cypress Cove condominiums, the pastor of Mariners Church, and then we invited the owners of the Stone Pine Retail and Commercial Centers. They weren't able to come, but they emailed me with all of their comments. So we had their comments as well. We held a second community workshop with the Park and Rec Commission about a week later and really got some strong support for the design. And in between, I want to add, we had a field trip with a couple members of the commission and several members of city staff. We went to see what this project would look like on steroids by visiting Stern Grove in San Francisco, which is a fantastic outdoor performance venue. If you've never been, they have free concerts every Sunday during the summer. They've had attendance of as many as 15,000 people. We will be nowhere near that at this site, I guarantee you. Last week, we did a city council update just to bring them up to date on what's been worked on thus far and what we heard from the community. Got really positive and, in fact, unanimous support from the council members who were there for moving this project forward. So now we're here with you tonight. Oh, I'm sorry, that is the right next slide, which is to talk about a survey we did, because in addition to getting input from people who were able to attend the meetings, we wanted to give everybody in the community an opportunity to respond. So we had a survey which was open for about 3.5 weeks. I wrote 6 by mistake. And it was apparently the most highly responded to survey that the city's held. We got 102 responses, and they were almost all supportive of the proposed project. We were asking people questions like, have you attended performances here before? That's when we heard from a lot of people, where's Carter Park? How do you get here? We tested, and most people walk, but we also had people who come by car and by bicycle or get dropped off. And we asked, you know, beyond what we've talked about in terms of a performance venue and a place to eat lunch, what would you like to see here? And what we heard was more music, more live music for the community, places to relax and to have family picnics, and a lot of support for building a playground for children who live nearby. In terms of concerns, what we heard, number one was parking, number two was noise, but there was also concern expressed about traffic, about trash being left and potentially damaging landscaping at the adjacent properties, and about the fact that there are homeless people that live on the site, so the public safety aspect of the project. Just to give you the context, I'm sure you all know where this is, but I like including this slide to just sort of explain what's around the site. Carter Park is right beneath the bridge. You don't see it from the street, but there is a little sign there right now, and we're already working on an enhanced sign that would have a place for, you know, really prominently showing what the activities taking place in the park are that could be read from both directions as you approach the site. It's sunken down below the level of the Stone Pine Retail and Office Complex by about 18 feet. And then the Mariners Church, which took one of the original office buildings, also faces down towards it. We have the I have a pointer here. We have the U.S. Post Office right here, and then the Cypress Cove townhouses surrounded on these sides. Here's Pillarcetus Creek running through here, and the city has planted a number of years ago a large grove of redwood trees on the site that surround the open area of the site. These are just a few pictures of what it looks like now. We have the entry sign along Main Street. We have the sidewalk, which is all going to need to get replaced, which is actually on the property of the shopping center. But we're going to want to replace the sidewalk and the fence and provide some lighting for that. As you come down into the parking lot, here's the little entry portal to the park itself, the stairway down, and as you can see, there are only minimal improvements. We've got a hillside slope that goes up, which is what's suggested. It's an ideal site for a stepped amphitheater. And then we have the redwood grove as you look south. The only built improvements really are this little path roadway that allows the vehicles to come down to the site to help the Shakespeare Company get all their equipment and staging and all of that down. And it provides maintenance access for city vehicles. And then there is a low stone circular wall, which is always covered up by the stage when the performances are done now. And then there's a sculpture of the Michelin Man, which is falling apart, so is slated for removal. But we're talking about replacing that with a little sort of dedication sign that would tell people the story of who John Carter was and why the park was named for him. So this is, we had a survey done, and this is the property line of the land that's the city park right here, okay? So as you can see, the parking for the shopping center and office plaza are up above. Here's the shopping center, the office parking's right here. This is the access road that loops down into the site. Here's the stone circle and the sculptures over here. All of this entry path, the little place where the sign is, the parking, all of that is on the shopping center property right now. In beginning the project, the city hired Harvey and Associates to do an initial biotic study to determine the edge of the riparian corridor and then what the 50-foot buffer zone would be from that. And what we learned was that that buffer zone, in fact, eats up almost half of the site of the park. It also extends right up onto the property of the shopping center where all the parking is. It goes over a corner of the church and part of an office building as well. Right now, the call is for a 50-foot buffer, and that's one of the things we want to talk to you about, because that does limit how much development we could do on the site. This is our proposed master plan at this point. Begins with a new entry along Main Street.
Excuse me for
Yes.
just a moment. I wonder if there's anything we can do about that, that glare of sun. Perhaps you can see it better than I can, but it's pretty impossible from here.
Yeah, I can't read that part of the slide.
Thank you for forbearance.
Oh, yeah. Now it's this window up here, I think.
Yeah, we have the benefit of the slide back there for the commission. If you guys want to
But
turn
that's
around, it
really
might be
blurry.
easier to see that. No better? Oh, well, let's soldier on.
I know several of the people here have seen this before, but it's a new version from last week. Yeah, it's been updated since last week considerably. So here is the entry along Main Street, and like I said, we want to introduce a sign, probably a low one, that's visible from both directions to help welcome you to the site. And then we'll rebuild the path and provide lighting along it with bicycle parking in this area up here, because we'd like to encourage people to bicycle to the site. Then when you arrive at this point, which is slightly shifted from where the current stair down is, we'll have the stair that comes down as well as a ramp that takes you to the mid-level of the site, which is one, so we can have accessible seating up at the top of the amphitheater and then using this longer ramp at the bottom of the amphitheater. So we'll have a couple places at different heights where wheelchairs can sit. The top lawn area would just be a gently sloping lawn right now, and then we'd begin our amphitheater at this mid-level. Also at that level, over the roof of the restroom building, we'll have a viewing platform, which is also where the lighting panel and the sound panel will be during the performances. As you come down into the site, there's a large lawn that can accommodate anywhere from 100 to 150 people, depending on if they're spreading out blankets or setting up little chairs for themselves. That grew in response to comments we got from the Park and Rec Commission, who wanted to be sure to have a large enough area for dancing when they have music in the park. And then this is our stage, which was designed to the specifications that were given to us by the Shakespeare Company. They wanted a 24-foot by 36-foot stage, and behind it there's a little service building for the stage that would have a large storage room and a couple of changing rooms with doors that'll come out the sides so that the actors can enter the stage here for performance. And we're actually working on that more now to kind of create a wall in front of those doors so the actors can kind of really come in nicely and have an area to set the backdrop of their set. On this side of the site, we're proposing a large play area and a picnic ground. And the play area will have resilient paving in it so kids won't get hurt. But one of the cool things our landscape architects are working at, and I should mention the landscape architects are the same firm that are working on the bridge project. That's why we engage them. The two projects are right next to each other. They've proposed, and I'll show you an image of it, a sloping sliding climbing wall built into the natural hillside, and we love that idea. And then you have a nice picnic area here. And through the redwood trees, there's been a request through an earlier agreement to build a solidarity grove, but we thought we already have the trees. So we're proposing to create a little solidarity path that runs between the redwoods and just creates a little loop on the site that might have some educational signage along it about the history of solidarity within Half Moon Bay and also about the redwoods and the riparian zone that's next to it. This is just an enlarged plan sort of showing you the detail at the ground floor that now also includes the second building, which houses men's and women's restrooms, all accessible, and a small concession and ticketing booth that any organization that's running an event down there can use. We've created access for the truck and a little backup so it can get up to the stage to drop things off and back up here and come back out again. And here's our accessible path both to the playground and looping you back around for the lower level of the seating. I'm sorry, that light is really in a bad place. I wish I could pick up the screen and move it over a little bit. Because you're not seeing the backstage building right there. Our thought now, this is a little outdated, is actually to do a fabric cover over the stage that could be on sometimes and off sometimes, that's supported in the front with a little truss up here that will support lighting and speakers. We saw on a much larger scale a system like that at Stern Grove, and it really worked well. Because this is in a floodplain, we're setting the stage up 30 inches, which is really as high as you can go, because otherwise you need rails around it. But that was the height the Shakespeare Company asked for. And the buildings would be built of concrete masonry so that they're weather durable if the floodwaters do get a little above that. Here, oops, sorry about that. I held that for a second too long. This technology is working tonight, though. That was my fault. Here you can see the redwood trees. Here's the little restroom building that has a really cool viewing platform up on the roof of it. These are the steps of the amphitheater, and they'll be sized such that people could put chairs on them, or usually you just measure, 18 to 20 people, 18 to 20 inches per person in width, and we can sit about another 200 people up there if we want. And if we did chairs up there, you can get even more. So you can probably get a total of about 400 people in here for an event, which would be just great. Now, what this diagram shows is where our proposed project overlaps the buffer zone to the riparian corridor. First, as I mentioned, this whole area that's already developed up here is within the buffer zone, and this little sliver along here is actually within the riparian zone. That's part of the existing sidewalk, and our new sidewalk would go in the same location. So we have a little tiny overlap, but it's already developed as a sidewalk, so we wouldn't be changing anything up there. The parking, as you can see, all falls within it at this point. Then we loop down into the site. We're sort of in the redwoods here, and we come along, in and along the edge of the redwoods, but we're in a little from the redwoods into the existing lawn area. And our proposed backstage building extends about a maximum at this corner of 16 feet into the buffer zone. So it's currently 50 feet. We have 34 feet to the back of the building at that corner and about 40 feet to the back of the building at that corner. Then, as you can see, we're okay for a while, but then we get our playground, a corner of the playground extending into it. And in order to get the accessible ramp to work without needing rails, we need 20 feet of length for every 1 foot of height change. So that does extend as well into it. And we're talking that might be a decomposed granite ramp or something like a material like that. And the truck access is already existing, and that's cutting through that zone as well. There's one more sliver that overlaps the actual riparian zone. It's about 4 feet wide at this end, and that's another existing condition. So these are our overlaps. And I said, to illustrate the fact that we are requesting a reduction in the width of the buffer at a couple points, I wanted to show what would happen if we took the building and shifted it entirely out of the buffer. And as you can see, it wipes out the lawn. The slope of the amphitheater is set by the existing slope of the site. We're working with the existing grade. And our goal is to really make it feel like a natural amphitheater that fits there. But the lawn's a very important component of the project because you need that for dancing when you have music, and to have the seats close to the stage. And moving the stage this far forward really impedes on that. We'd also have to cut out a portion of the playground. These roads are already, this road, it's the vehicular path and the accessible path. This is already existing, so we're hoping that's not an issue. The same with the stuff up here, which is already existing. So now I wanted to just show you a few images of what this might look like. This is a little bigger because our initial thought was a little larger than what we wound up with, but this shows you our idea of the stage, the viewing platform over the roof of the restrooms, the new stair coming down with the amphitheater seating next to it, the lawn in front of the stage, and the playground and picnic area just nestled in the redwoods, which I think is going to be really lovely. You know, we might still have an entry piece like this. Our pathways would have low-level illumination so that they will be safer, but nothing high. Here's an example of what the stage with the lawn might look like, although we're leaning against the solid roof and for more of a fabric roof right now that's removable. Here's people sitting on the lawn, whether they bring their blankets or their chairs. Here's what the amphitheater steps would look like. And people can spread out on blankets, but more often than not in these kind of settings, people just sit on the edge of the steps to watch performance. I live up at Hamilton Field in Novato, and the old military base had an amphitheater that was restored as part of the base reuse project, and it's really fantastic. They do movies at night there and stuff, and it's a really fun place. Here's the idea of the playground nestled in the trees, which can be a really nice feature. And here's an example of a slide and a climbing piece that are set into a slope, which is what we would have. And then picnicking in the Grove, I think, would be lovely. People could come before the performances and eat either on the steps or eat down at the site like this. And then this is the notion of the trail through the redwoods. It's not a paved trail, but it's more of a dirt path that wouldn't go down to the creek, but the idea is that it would run between the redwoods with some interpretive signage to create the notion of the Solidarity Grove. When we heard the neighbor concerns, as I mentioned, the strongest concern we heard was for parking. Now, there haven't been problems with parking at the Shakespeare Festival thus far. The city's not gotten any complaints about it. There weren't complaints at the Summer's End Music Festival, which was the largest attended event in the park, I believe, to date. But there's plenty of parking available within a 5-minute walk of the park. The city has already met with the folks at the post office, and we would be allowed to park in their front lot there. We'd be allowed to park in the office park and the church, and there's a lot of parking available downtown and here at the Adcock Center, all of which is less than a 5-minute walk from the site. And if you go slightly further, you've got the parking lot at the high school, and if that proves, that's within a 10-minute walk, but the city might opt to provide some shuttle service when we use the overflow lots that are a little further away. So we strongly believe that parking can be addressed without impacting the neighbors at Cypress Cove. The other pieces of that are public education. We have to let people know where they should park before the events through public noticing, through the website and other factors, and a little bit of temporary signage. Great big no parking signs at the entry to Cypress Cove, and no through traffic and everything before the events take place, and those signs would come down after the event. The other issues we heard about were things like noise, trash, light, and public safety. We've already gotten a proposal from Charles Salter, who's probably the top acoustical engineer in the Bay Area, to do a noise study on the site. And I confirmed today there was some questions about how he might do that, and he can do it. They can definitely alter it to test what the impacts of various noise levels would be at the properties that would be impacted potentially impacted. The good news is it is sunken, and there's the buffer of the commercial property between the site and the homes. And on this side, you're surrounded by a big landscape buffer. But like I said, we have a proposal now to address that. Public safety, the hope is that by providing more activity in the park, by having a playground, having a picnic area, it will be more activated, and the eyes on the park are what's going to make it a safer place, combined with the low-level lighting. And we'll work carefully to ensure that the lighting's directed into the park, not out of the park, so that it won't impact neighbors. So that basically wraps up my performance. My presentation. And thank you all for listening, and I would be glad to answer any questions you may have. I think I'll go back to a pretty drawing like that. And I can always flip back if there are images you'd like to see again when you're asking questions. Just let me know. I have the controller.
Thank you. Scott, did you want to add more, or are you turning it back over to us now?
We'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, great. Any clarifying questions before we invite the public? Yes, Commissioner Reddick.
Well, I have a couple. Would you mind showing the slide again that shows the riparian buffer and what you felt would be necessary to keep development out of that buffer?
Well, we can't keep the parking, any of the existing stuff
Of course.
already there within the buffer.
Understood.
Two main areas of concern for us are the stage and backstage building, which you can see if I shift it forward from this green line up to this line here that clears the buffer. That 16-foot move eats up a large percentage of our lawn. This needs to be a little wider paved area because we have wheelchair seating down at the bottom of the amphitheater. The other area that's impacted is right here, that corner of the playground. That's, I think, less critical. I think we can have a smaller playground that's still a nice playground that doesn't fall within it, but this, to us, is a serious problem.
So I guess you're making an assumption about the necessary sizes of the stage and the building behind it.
No, that was based on our discussions with the Shakespeare Festival representatives. They told us how big a stage, how big a storeroom, and the fact that they wanted 2 changing rooms as well. So all that information came from our discussions with them.
Okay. Well, I may have some more comment on that before we're done, but a couple of other questions. Can anybody speak to the homelessness question and the location and scope of that? Maybe Matthew, best able.
So, as you know, the city, Matthew Chittister, Deputy City Manager, good to be with you tonight. As you know, the city took on working with homelessness pretty intensively over the last several years in response to several large encampments. We did have a small encampment at Carter Park over the last several years and worked with those individuals, and they moved out last spring, May of 2018. Since that time, we haven't had any encampments develop. Occasionally, we do have folks that go back there and try to set up camp. Any of the areas along the Riparian Creek areas that are city-owned property, we're able to move pretty quickly to work with those folks to get them to move. So we don't see it as an issue now, but we know that as we talk with neighbors, it's something that had a presence there for a long time, and I think it's just always a concern for them.
And if this gets built and the usage is what we hope, then that would obviously be even more important than ever before.
Yeah, our belief and what we found in other areas is the more active an area is, the less desirable it is for folks to want to go and live.
Good deal. Thank you.
Commissioner Pogar, any questions?
Not at the moment.
Okay, a couple. First, let me ask Matthew if you could return. Part of the homeless in the vicinity of the park that may or may not be easy for the city to address is the folks who have taken up residence in the Caltrans easement in the area immediately under Highway 1. As we move forward with some project in this area, to the extent that it connects, when you talk about activating it and the ability to address concerns, do you see or foresee a change in the ability to address those folks who take up residence on the trail in that area?
So, thanks for the question. I don't think activating Carter Park will have any impact on the homelessness along Pillars Creek between Main Street and the Highway 1 bridge, is I believe where you're discussing. Mostly because there's a large section of private properties between the Main Street Bridge and Highway 1 Bridge and Main Street. So I don't think there would be an impact from this project. Obviously, the city's working with the private property owners on Caltrans to work with those individuals to not be taking up residence in those areas.
I see, thank you. And then a question for staff. I know that a trail is a permitted use in a riparian buffer. Can you tell me whether you believe it's the staff position that some of the other uses that are proposed are permitted uses in a riparian buffer zone?
We'd be happy to review our code a bit with you. Yes, trails are potentially permitted uses in riparian buffers, and in fact are also potentially permitted uses in the ESHA per our zoning code, per the LCP. We are not intending to push trails in that area, and I will get to the second half of your question, but before getting there, I wanted to mention a couple things about the environmental review that is going to be conducted for this project, because it's completely relevant to your question. As you saw, our project architect presented the riparian buffer, which had been mapped by H.D. Harvey. That was the very first thing that we had done on this project before bringing the architect on board as really a backstop for what the project needed to be. H.D. Harvey will continue and complete the full BRE, the biological resources evaluation, and also you heard about the noise studies. So all those technical studies are being done. One thing that's challenging for us about this particular buffer is how much development is already in it. Not just the seating wall, but all those redwood trees. They are development relative to the riparian corridor. They are not riparian habitat. They're beautiful, and we're not proposing to change the thing. You see, we're trying to work with them, but they are definitely a change in the environment for that area. The stage in particular is really what they're seeking, and I would say no unless you would make a finding of no feasible alternative. I think it's pretty clear there's probably a feasible alternative with the playground, and that it could be smaller and still quite nice. The stage is tricky, and a couple more things about the planning that got here. The project architect, Mark, really emphasized all the work that was done with the Shakespeare folks, our local performing communities, and that was really important. But this project team also has a designer who is an expert in performance space and the stage sizes, heights, and relationship to the audience. And that was all taken into account relative to the input from the different community groups and what we know to be true about how the space actually works. So that layout it's an interesting one for that question of no feasible alternative. You really can't swing the stage and they tried it in a lot of different places to get the seating to work with it. And so it's an interesting part of your consideration. It's why we are trying to daylight it really brightly for you before you see it under a CDP and before we get through the CEQA review. I hope that long-winded answer was helpful.
No, I appreciate the answer. You know, I probably have other comments there. Did something come to you that you wanted to raise now? Sure.
You mentioned watching movies, and I think it was not relation to this, but I was wondering, is that one of the uses planned for this as well?
We hadn't talked about it yet, but I know what they do where I live is they have one of those little inflatable movie screens that they project on like once a month during the summer for a twilight movie night. But we hadn't talked about it here.
Nothing else? Okay, then we have several people who have asked to speak. Oh, I'm sorry, Rick. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Rick. You're on. Go ahead, Rick.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to channel my Brian Holt and say abuse drives out bad. So I know there's this space is a tricky space, and I just want to comment on, I think this is a fantastic initial design. I'm curious, I know there's a lot of concerns here, but I'm curious why we didn't make more of an effort to have an interpretive trail along Pillar Cedars Creek. It's an area that, while it is a sensitive habitat, it gives people in the community a chance to interact with it. It becomes more of an interactive community, and I just wonder about what the thought process is there in terms of making the parts of that accessible so that people can get a better appreciation of the wildlife habitat that we have and the very special environment that is.
Would you
Sounds
care
like
to
a great
respond?
Yeah, I think it's a great suggestion. I think, it would be wonderful to actually take the trail to the creek and have some signage.
Is your
along.
microphone on, sir?
No, it's on. Oh, it's on. I was just saying, I think it's a great sounding idea. We were just being very cautious because we know this is a sensitive issue.
Thank you. Go ahead, Rick.
Were you asking me to repeat my question again?
No, we got it, and we got an answer. I didn't know if you had more or you were yielding.
No, I'm yielding the floor.
Okay, I hope you got the answer. Were you able to hear it? He thought it was a great, to paraphrase, he thought it was a great idea. He's conscious of the sensitivity of the location.
Thank you.
All right. One more from Commissioner Pilgar.
Can we go back to the slide that showed the property line? I just wanted to make sure I understood. Oh, I guess you can see it on this.
You can see it on this
Okay.
one, yeah.
And so to the, I guess it's to the west or southwest, and the creek is a little ways.
Creek is down from there.
Yeah, okay. And so it's down, it's not right there.
No.
Yeah.
The creek's down in here.
And who owns that property? Oh, it's fine. I just was
No,
wondering.
there's a piece that's the city's, and then it transitions into the private property, and
Okay.
without the parcel lines, it's kind of hard to.
Oh, that's fine. I just was trying to determine where the creek was with respect to the project.
Please.
I just wanted to add on to our architect's answer regarding the Pillar Cedars Creek concept of a trail that Commissioner Hernandez brought up, because there's two primary documents that relate to it. One is the adopted 1995 Parks and Recreation General Plan element. That trail is named, and there is a dashed line on a map for it. Two is your bicycle and pedestrian master plan. In that plan, the trail is also named, but it is considered to be a study for the alignment of it, and in fact is not actually mapped for part of the planning area because there's so much going on along the corridor, but that's really mostly on the west side of Highway 1. But the third piece is what was in your packet, and that folks may or may not have seen. It's just really interesting in the history of what's happened with the development of the Andreotti PD of when it was done, is that there is a recorded trail easement. And we put that in your packet because we thought it was really interesting. Scott did the research and he found that, and we wanted you to have all of the context.
We like having all the content. Thank you. So if there are no further questions, I want to give the public a chance to give us their good advice. These are in the order that I think I received them, so bear with me. The first speaker will be Lee Ellis. You have 3 minutes. From the time you start.
Thank you. My name is Lee Ellis.
Welcome.
I'm a co-founder of Half Moon Bay Shakespeare Company and serve as its CFO, associate producer. And my fellow colleagues are here with me tonight from the Half Moon Bay Shakespeare Company. And I want to thank the Planning Commission and the City of Half Moon Bay, Scott Phillips, Jill Ekus, and Mark Schatz for his presentation. it's been very valuable to us all. We happily adopted Carter Park 6 years ago with the intention of performing our Shakespearean plays there. And we saw it as a beautiful atmosphere for outdoor theater. And we believe that Shakespeare is best performed outdoors. We also had in mind that we wanted to lead the way to encourage other entertainment organizations to use this venue also. So we thought we could take the first step in doing that. And since then, we've noticed in the last 6 years, the interest in Carter Park has grown thanks very much to the city. And, we hope that, and we have seen that there's more usage from the public at the park. I wanted to say that we're very, very grateful to all of you for your support and your cooperation throughout these years in working with us on permitting and all of the things that we've wanted to achieve. And also, we are extremely appreciative that after conversations that we've had of things that we've needed and asked for, that you've heard us, and you have helped us very much. We appreciate the efforts of Mark Schatz and his colleague at ELS for including us in the design plans and the vision for Carter Park. We spent a lot of time answering many, many questions and writing reports, and so that they would understand one point of view, which was from our Shakespeare company. And as to the stage piece, which is, as you pointed out, the back of which is close to the riparian corridor, we spent a lot of time in that, and there's a reason that we orient the stage where it is in Carter Park and where we've actually kept it within that circle, and it is all about sound. We've considered moving it to the south end of the park, but capturing sound is a big deal when you're performing outdoors. And so we actually told them the exact orientation that we think we should have to the hillside that will best capture what is going on down there. So I just wanted to say that. And then also, as to parking, we do have permission from Mariners Church to have our patrons park there, but I was just thinking that it would be a good idea for us to put it on our website as well. So I just wanted to mention that. So we just are very happy about this. We think that it's adding to the whole cultural aspect of the city of Half Moon Bay, and we're thrilled about this new plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Gail Irwin, please. Welcome.
I'm Gail Irwin, and I'm proud to be a member of the board of the Half Moon Bay Shakespeare Company. And I'm going to be very brief tonight, but I would like to say that having experienced that first walk around with the architect and talking, I get all weepy about it, because it's so exciting to see that, first of all, as Lee said, we've been listened to. People actually did talk to us about what the needs might be for a performance of any kind, really, in that space. And we think it's a wonderful space for performance. But also, it's just been an exciting adventure to see this begin to emerge from the mist and take shape for us as a real plan. I just spent quite a bit of time going around and selling ads for our program for As You Like It, which is coming up very soon, opening August 16th in the park. And please come and see it, and then you'll know what we're talking about. But as I went around, I used this wonderful illustration that you've been seeing on the screen, and I showed it to people about what was happening at Carter Park, and I can't tell you how excited people are. They're just absolutely excited. So thank you very much, and we really appreciate your interest and help.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mike Ferreira, please. Welcome.
Good evening, Chair Benjamin, and Acting Chair Benjamin, and Commissioners. Let me just start with the Solidarity Trail and the arrow to the west, which would give one the impression that you're going to take the trail to the bridge or possibly go under the bridge. I'm just here to say there's no room to do that. That would be rather destructive to the stream itself if you tried to do that. And so I hope that's not what I'm looking at here. I've also been down there and I've looked at the thickness of the riparian area, the amount of destruction you would do in order to run that trail through that riparian area would be awful. And so I just, I hope that's just not some unspoken thing here, and I think it probably needs to be clarified. I don't see this city as wanting to subscribe to that kind of damage to the riparian area. The playground, I guess, that area, as stated earlier, is 18 feet below what once was the edge of the creek, I guess. And there's just something about the whole idea of putting a playground that's out of public view that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And I just would wonder if the sheriff's department could be consulted as to their opinion of it. And unless you're going to somehow put some really strong fencing along the riparian area, I wouldn't want my grandkids down there, especially if they were on their own. So now let me get to the worst one of all, which is the buffer zone. The buffer zone of 50 feet, you're not supposed to go into it unless there's no alternative. Just coming up with a good cause or a nice cause to go into the buffer zone, I don't think the Planning Commission has the authority to do that. And I'm speaking for the Sierra Club when I say that. You're supposed to be, you don't go there unless there's no alternative. There can be alternatives. It can be to the west, it can be to the east. It doesn't have to be right behind the stage, although I granted that would be the most convenient. But that convenience is not adequate to justify going into the buffer zone. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ken King. Welcome.
Good evening, Commissioner Benjamin and Planning Commissioners. First of all, let me just say, as a Shakespeare buff, I really commend all of you for your work. I think it's a very handsome plan. But I want to also bring up a sort of a contravening notion, which is prior to all your ideas about putting a theater here in what is essentially a buffer area of ESHA, we go look at Plan Half Moon Bay, which the city is still working on. And you go in and you look at the statement about ESHAs and the importance of ESHAs in the city. And it's a long paragraph about their importance and our commitment to maintaining them. And then right after that, it goes through the various types of ESHAs. And there's a category for the riparian corridors in the Central Coast Scrub area, which is dominated by willows. And it talks about the species of concern that are in there. And it's not comprehensive. It mentions some. It doesn't mention all the ones that possibly go through there, but it does talk about the Migratory Bird Act. And that habitat is very important for spring, passers through, migrants, nesting birds, and in the fall for migrants in the other direction. I was down there last Thursday, and it was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I was walking that area to look at the Harvey outline of the buffer area, where a Cooper's hawk flew into a tree, and it was hunting in that area. And when you go look at Cooper's hawk, it's a bird of concern in this area, but they said they nest south of town. I think they're nesting in town. So that's a concern. And as far as the buffer, there's one little catch I want to just bring up. When you look at page 66 and 67 of the general plan, and you look at the description of the riparian corridor, west of Highway 1 is 50 feet for a buffer. It doesn't say anything except 100 feet unless there's major development already in an area. So the idea that there's a 50-foot corridor, a buffer there, I think is not clear from the way it's being written. It appears to be still 100 feet from the old plan because it hasn't been clarified. So I would bring that up as a concern. I know my time is over, but I'm going to say all of this is major development. Concrete structures, lighting, lots of people coming into the area. And we don't just have a riparian corridor, we have a wildlife corridor because they pass under the bridge and there's a lot of woods on the other side, you know, if you've ever looked at the other side, Safeway, for example.
If you could wrap up your thoughts, please.
Okay, so the point is that with all this development, it's not going to be a wildlife corridor anymore.
Thank you very much, Mr. King. The next comment will be from Paul Grigoriev. Welcome. In a stroke of irony, I can't hear you.
Try it again. There we are. How's that? Okay, good evening, commissioners. I just had a couple of quick questions that maybe I could get some clarification a little later in this session about handicapped access to this new development. If I'm a handicapped person and I'm driving to get here to begin with, where do I park? I believe there are 2 handicapped spaces up in the commercial area and maybe one more down towards the hamburger place. So that's a total of 3 parking spots for this, what do we hear, several hundred people who would be attending? That might be a problem. And the question would be, okay, let's say I can park somewhere back, is this the eastern direction? Back toward the east? How far do I have to walk to get from my car to this site, and what's the grade that I have to climb to go up this path? Or alternatively, what's the grade I have to be able to come down to get to the, I think they were described as handicapped spots above the refreshment stand structure? And if we assume that the person has a good deal of difficulty walking and could be with a wheeled walker or a wheelchair, have people thought about that? Has any handicapped person been at all involved in the planning of the facility? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And the last green card I have on this item tonight is from Carol Black. Ms. Black, welcome. If someone else wants to speak, they can fill in a green card later and just let me know in a minute when we finish hearing from Mrs. Black. Ms. Black. Bridget will show you. Oh,
Success. Thank
now you just need to aim the microphone at your mouth.
Bridget will fix it. Thank you.
She takes care of everything
Thank
here.
you, Bridget. What would we do without Bridget? I'll be very brief. I actually, in some level, I'm going to pick up on what was just said. but be a little bit broader. I've heard now this presentation, I think, 3 times, which is great, and I like a lot of the ideas. I live in Cypress Cove, and I've heard several times that, and there's that lovely little circular picture with the parking that's close by, that parking's not going to be a problem. And I think that that's basically magical thinking. And what I would, and those of you who heard me at the parks, I'm saying the same thing. So I apologize for singing the same song. All I've heard is assertion. There's parking spaces. They are there. But have we looked to see if they're occupied at the times we're going to be putting on performances? No. Has there been a parking study? No. We're going to do a noise study, but I haven't heard anything about parking. And I would suggest, respectfully, that at a minimum, parking would need to be looked at for every event and thought through how we would manage the parking for every particular event at the time of day and day of the week that it's going to occur. We just heard in Cypress Cove that the church has leased the post office parking space for Sunday mornings. The church's parking is also full on Sunday mornings. So there's spaces there, but if you're going to do something on Sunday morning, you're going to have to park on top of cars. So enough said. I just think we need to be cautious about the impacts and make sure we've really thought through and done appropriate studies to be sure it's taken care of. I also know that some of the public bathrooms, like at the beaches, different story, I get it, but when you look at Yelp and everything, there's not a lot of enthusiasm about the cleanliness there. So trash, cleaning, you get the drift here. I think those are all important, and particularly when I live right around the corner and my grandchildren will be running through there. I would appreciate that being addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else from the public who wants to speak on this item this evening? If not, I'm going to close the public hearing and invite staff to address any comments they want to before we bring it back so that my colleagues can consider the wise advice and enthusiasm we heard from you tonight, for which I thank you.
So staff, I apologize to the last speaker that we did not present this. We are going to conduct a parking survey. And as suggested for looking at orienting the parking survey to the most traditional performance times would be how we would do it. I would be looking at it also for your next item tonight because we're going to be talking about parking codes. And so we have an intern who will be preparing this. He will do a parking occupancy study. We've supervised these before. We know how to do them, and we'll get a number of checkpoints for when to do it, how many times over, and the radius from the park, as well as another area that we'll be looking at. The last parking study, kind of similar to this, that was done was about 2014, so we think that's pretty stale. So we absolutely want to update that and appreciate your feedback. And then it looks like our city engineer also has some information about technical studies.
Good evening. My name is Maz Bajignia, city engineer. Just wanted to echo a little bit on the parking study. We have preliminary started gathering information. Within that 5-minute walking radius, we have about 1,000 public spaces that's available. Now, the timing of when it's going to happen, that's the next step, but that is, although we didn't touch on it earlier, that is an important piece that we are considering as part of our development of this project.
Thank you. Okay, in that case, I think I'm ready to bring it back to the commission. Gentleman, lady, who wants to talk? Ladies first. Oh, I'm sorry, Rick. Thank you. I forgot you were here.
My shy and demure style. One of the challenges with Carter Park today is that it's cold, and the video presentation is not working right now. So one of the questions I had for, how is the design working to improve, like, either protection from the wind or make it a little sunnier. Is that part of the design?
Yeah, to get a response from, for Rick, I'm going to reopen the public hearing briefly. Go ahead.
What we've looked at is some kind of a temporary shade windscreen structure that could go up at the top of the amphitheater seating. The problem is it's really windy here. So we can't really do a permanent structure because it would probably get blown down. So what we're finding is, for lack of a better word, they're like big umbrellas that can be set up before performances. At this point, we don't think the project budget's going to be able to carry it, so we're looking at it as a future addition to it, but we are talking and thinking about that. We just don't have the answer yet. The ones we're looking at are used commonly around public pools to provide shade, but they tilt so that they can also provide a little wind protection. The best thing for the wind protection might be, where the trees are and potentially adding a few more trees up at the top of the site.
Any follow on, Rick? Rick?
No, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Oh. Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Yes, while you're up there. So, no escape. So my understanding is that in the building, that's the changing rooms, and then what else is housed in there?
Storage. So
Okay.
there are props for the plays. There are set elements that would be kept in there. There might even be some parts of the set construction that would be kept in there when they're not in performance. That might be where some of the speakers or lighting would go. So it's storage for the theater-related events.
And then I'm assuming that's where you said that there's the doors, so that's where the actors.
The actors would come in
out.
and out, yeah.
All right, but some part of it is for storage,
Right.
though. Okay. Thank you.
Sure, and there's 2 changing rooms was what the request was for.
Okay. Any, do you want to shift, or do you have more questions for, nope? Okay, so we'll close the public hearing again and bring it back. Who wants to start? Commissioner Reddick.
Thank you. Well, this is, no doubt this is an exciting project, and I applaud the way it's been run with the cooperation of staff and the various vendors involved, and especially the gathering of the input from the public. I think it's great to see this coming together as a multi-use project with encompassing performing arts and playground facilities, picnic tables and trails. I think I don't think anybody could deny that all of those will be a positive addition to the community and help to us make the downtown even more vibrant than it is today. My big question about it is whether the proportion of the conceptual design is correct for these multi-uses. I know from almost daily anecdotal experience passing by Ocean View Park that the playgrounds and picnic tables there are very popular this summer, remarkably so, I think. I think it'd be great for us to have more of those in an accessible place like Carter Park. But I wonder whether obviously the performing arts are the linchpin of this design, right? The majority of the land is given over to that. And while the picnic tables and playgrounds I would expect would be in use on a daily basis, I think even if performing arts become wildly more popular than they are today, they're unlikely to be used as often. And I know that doesn't mean that you can shrink them down to indefinitely, but it makes me wonder whether that and the question about the what do you call the building behind the stage, the storage? Yeah, that plus the question of whether it really makes sense for the storage building to intrude into the riparian buffer. It makes me wonder whether the proportions of the multi-uses are correct here. Jill, I know you mentioned, I understand you said there were a lot of alternatives looked at for the size and shape of the stage and the storage building, and I understand the issues about the audio, but I think I'd want to see some more takes on that. I'd want to see that we had put our best thinking caps on and explored some alternatives before we could decide that there's no alternative to intruding into the riparian buffer. So that's my big question. I may have a couple minor questions, but that's all I have right now, Jimmy.
Sure, so you can reload here while we hear from Commissioner Polgar. Or Rick, are you ready to go?
So I really appreciate the thoughtfulness in this design. I think going to the multi-use thing, I think the scale question is a really interesting question to consider. I will say I can see this space getting a lot more usage as it becomes a more pleasant, less gloomy space. We don't have a lot of areas like this in Half Moon Bay, and I can see a lot of the high school kids flocking to an area like this if it becomes as pretty as it's envisioned here. While I'm supportive of a playground, I do think we need to put some thought into it. Mike Farrar's comments about working with the Sheriff's Department to get their feedback on what's appropriate or not might be, a reasonable thing. I'm struggling a little bit thinking that maybe we're pushing too much into this space. So I've mixed feelings on the park, the playground area. I do think we need more playgrounds, and I don't think there are any playgrounds in any close proximity to this neighborhood. So it's definitely a good site for a playground for sure. I just wonder if it couldn't be situated up on the banks or closer to the parking lot so that it had a better sight line to the street. But, those are just design questions or concerns that I have. Very supportive of performance-based metrics that Jill spoke about when evaluating the trade-offs and the conditions of approval. So I think that's a really smart approach to take. And very supportive of lots of picnic tables there. The area would benefit with more picnic tables, more usability. And I think that while I'm very, very concerned about destroying wildlife habitat, and I think that we need to take great care in protecting the wildlife habitat and the bird nesting areas, I do think there are a lot of rehabilitation opportunities with the creek. There are a lot of invasive species there today. There's a lot of damage. There's a lot of litter from the homeless community, unfortunately, and others who put things there that needs to be addressed. So I think this is a great opportunity to rehabilitate the creek area and make it a better use, more widely enjoyed by the public, and more sustainable for the wildlife habitat. So I'm very supportive of this project. I just think we need to make sure we address some of these open questions.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Hernandez. Commissioner Polgar.
Thank you. I really appreciated the comment from Commissioner Ruddock about the proportions and scale. I'm having trouble envisioning kind of how this will all fit. It seems like a bit much as well. I also, I do wonder about the scale and size of the playground area and the location. I thought that was an interesting point that Mr. Ferrara brought up about the sight lines and such. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the best location without having that. And I will say that, so I work in the building right next to this park, and my window looks out on it. And mostly people hang out in the area a little bit more where kind of where the grassy area is shown in the slide that's up there right now. So That's where like, a group of kids are usually out there every day, and they're hanging out and playing in that area. But also just up at the up at the path, I think partly as well above the park, because it is warmer. So it's maybe good to look at kind of where people are using space. I am struggling. I think it's a very good point about really considering. I think that the trail, the Solidarity Trail, as it's shown, is fine. I was a little bit concerned to see the arrow kind of pointing straight out into the towards the creek. I don't want that to necessarily be a part. I don't want it to necessarily be a part of this project. I think there, as you saw, the riparian kind of area is already being squeezed by the existing development of the parking area, and that kind of can't change. And so I'd be pretty nervous about just seeing us say, yeah, let's try to squeeze a trail in there too. So and that I don't think I'm assuming that's not part of this project. So I wouldn't want to give that impression even. But I'm pretty concerned about the building extending into the riparian zone, and wondering if there is a way to orient the building, the storage aspect, like the parts that don't need to be right there. And I understand. I'm very supportive of making this space, like if you're going to have the performances there, I think that it's very important to make sure they're of quality and the acoustics work properly. I'm very supportive of that. I just don't know that if you're having storage, it seems like, does that need to extend into the riparian buffer? I would like to see other options if I were, reviewing in the environmental review of this, like whether there's options for moving that aspect of the structures. So I have some other comments but they're about a different area. Did you want to comment on this kind of aspect?
No, I want to facilitate all of the comments from all my colleagues, then I'll unload. Thank you.
So I realize that the entrance to this area from just after you cross the bridge and you're coming in from Main Street, that's an area that's a big mess right now. It's really hard to navigate that. Like I've actually walked into the sign. I was talking to somebody and I just walked straight into it because no one would expect that sign to be there. And I really think that needs a lot of work. I actually think that that's an area that needs to be expanded to make it easier because it's a sharp turn. And so not only is it hard for people to know that this park is here and that there's just a lot of work, and I don't see any, I'm hoping that that'll be built upon, because I think that's actually a key aspect of making this an accessible area. And for that matter, also, if the parking is going to be around the outside, there needs to be a much clearer ways to get to the park, and that's not just for, and I very much agree with the comment, I can't remember who made it, but about the disabled parking, that access, that's really important to look at, but just also in general from the other areas around the park, making that very clear. So that kind of wayfinding and access is of critical interest, and from my perspective.
Thank you. Are you reloaded, Steve?
Well, one minor thing. I spoke a minute ago in support of playgrounds here, which I do think is a good idea, but I also appreciate Mike Ferrara's comment about the peculiar situation of that, and I would also support working with the sheriffs on what ought to be done to optimize the configuration and sightlines of those.
Very good. Rick, did you want to take another round?
No, I think that I think I'm good. I mean, the one thing I'm looking at the different the concepts. The concept we have in our packet is definitely more of a strong amphitheater feel, more traditional amphitheater feel. And I see on the video feed the smaller amphitheater space. I mean, the thing that we don't have in the community is a public outdoor theater of any kind. And I think the emphasis should be put on how do we make that outstanding. And, you know, if we can do other things, that's great. But I really like having more seating, making the space as usable as possible. And I think that should be the primary function of the space. If we can support other uses like having picnic tables, I think that's a fantastic use of the space as well. But this is a theater. And so I just want to make sure that we're really hunkering down and getting our focus on making the theater a truly outstanding experience. And you know, there are other uses that the park can have as well, but that's my feedback.
Okay, great. Thank you all. Let me, oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Polgar, absolutely.
One other comment, and this may almost is kind of more of a question, in fact. So it's been my experience when I go down there that the ground stays really soggy a lot. And I'm wondering how that will, I mean, for when you're just down there, you know, hanging out, or, you know, it's not a big deal, but for the grassy area where people are supposed to be laying out their blankets, I could imagine it wouldn't be so pleasant if it were at all soggy. And this year it stayed soggy a long time. So I definitely appreciated the design of raising the stage, and then also thinking about having any structures be more resilient to flooding. I think that's very important, excellent. But I just wonder how practical it is to plan that people will be able to lay out picnic blankets on the grass. And I'm sure it depends on the year, the raininess. So it's just a question or comment, I guess.
Okay. All right, so yeah, so great comments, and I have a few to add. I agree with a lot of what I heard. First, I want to speak to the idea of the intrusion into the riparian corridor. I like to get the tough stuff out of the way early, and then we can look in some of the other areas. From a CEQA standpoint, we can certainly talk about impacts and what's feasible and infeasible from a project point of view. From the perspective of the local coastal program, for an intermittent stream, there are allowed projects in areas if there's no feasible use. I'd need to go back and take a very close look at Chapter 38 of the zoning ordinance and the policies of the LCP to see what would be a permitted use in this area. I think an interpretive trail in the riparian area, provided there is no adverse impacts, may be feasible. I think that Mr. Ferreira was accurate when he said that the drainage is rather thin. I mean, it does narrow to the point of the Pilarcitos, the Main Street Bridge. So I think it would require real engineering, and it's not obvious to me that it would go easily. It may not be feasible. And I think it's really important from a planning standpoint for us to take a very clear-eyed view about what impacts would be and what they aren't. And the distinction between what we could do on the ground with respect to vegetation and what we do with respect to the wildlife impacts is a significant distinction. It's not just what's permitted in the riparian corridor, because the California red-legged frog and the San Francisco garter snake habitat exists in Pilarcitos Creek. And light and encroachment could play a significant role in what happens in this area. So I think it's important for us to be very clear about what can and cannot be addressed. With respect to the idea that the use of storage would be the primary reason that we would intrude, I realize that that's an oversimplification, because the way an amphitheater works has to do with the elliptical structure of the seating and the way the sound radiates and works effectively. And I don't know what the foci of this particular amphitheater space is, but if there's a way to make it work sonically that allows you to get out of the riparian corridor, you cannot imagine how much easier it would be to move forward. So I would really encourage you to take a very close look at that and to see what can be done. With respect to the raised, and I think that would address the muddy blankets as well. If we needed a dance area, I think I agree with the linchpin argument that Commissioner Reddick, or comment, wasn't really an argument. If I had to choose, I'd probably create a little space, maybe where where some of the playground area is in the area that's outside of the riparian corridor, to get that use done well in order to achieve that. From a hydrologic perspective and hydraulic perspective, I have some reservations based on enough experience within Half Moon Bay of structures that are built on walls to encourage us to think very carefully about surfaces that would drain down into flat spaces, raised surfaces through which water, against which water would flow. I think that we would need to think carefully about how flanking erosion could be avoided in a circumstance like this. Even if your structure holds up, the ground around the structure through which the water would have to divert would be exposed. And so there's a lot of hydrologic thinking that would need to go into thinking about how to make that effective, even if the project is moved outside of the riparian buffer, because this area is going to get rain. And, I'll comment, I was actually on the Planning Commission in, I think it was 1997, when some of the buildings on the top above Carter Park were approved. It was one of the very first projects that I remember hearing. And my recollection was at the time that the edge of the riparian corridor was actually the upper, the bank adjacent to the buildings. If I go back to the definition in the local coastal program, a riparian corridor has to do with the drip line of riparian vegetation, but it also has to do with the extent in the area of the bank. So if you have a slope and a bank, there's something that we need to understand there. I'm not saying that we can't have a great park there. I think we should. But I want to be sure that we have clarity on how these definitions interact. I don't think that's a dagger. I just think it's important for us to clarify. With respect to the public safety issue, I was unclear on how many people actually could be seated there, but if there are order hundreds, I'd want clarity on evacuation, because it looks to me like it's a pretty narrow opportunity for people if they had to get out in a hurry. Do I think that's likely? No. Do I think we plan for it? Is something that the fire marshal will tell us, and we need to think that through carefully. Let's see. Just to reinforce what I believe my colleagues would say and staff would say, there's no concern with the city with the existing development that's in the riparian corridor. We don't do retroactive, you have to get this out kind of stuff. So our focus is on the things that would be proposed now. And we've been careful about understanding the riparian corridor. We certainly talked about it when we were reviewing the Mariners Church development a little while back. So I want to be careful, and I want to be consistent. Back to the trails, the picture showed some lighting, and I just want to be super clear that if that were in the habitat, it would be very problematic. For a couple of reasons. One is the wildlife would be adversely impacted, I think. But second, all of that electricity, this area does flood. So it would require, it's nice to hear that would be above. With respect to Mr. Grigoriev's comment, which was echoed by Commissioner Polgar about differently abled persons' access, I'm assuming that they would be getting in on the sort of ramp trail that exists already. So I think that's how they would get access once they get close. If there were more work, I'd want to see a lot of detail on that, so that we, I don't know what the standards are, but obviously we're committed to providing access where we can and reasonable accommodations, so we'd want clarity. Let's see. So we've talked about lighting. I think Commissioner Hernandez's point over the Polycom here about the temperature in the area, also, the winds in the area also speak to the acoustics. So as you're thinking about the design of the acoustics, please take into account the wind in the area. In my experience, trees have a very limited effect on insulating adjacent properties from sound. So they do a good job with light. They do a very limited job with sound. So I think hard about how you can avoid creating that much sound to begin with. And one of the nice designs of a great amphitheater is you don't need a lot of sound reinforcement, right? If it's designed really well and takes advantage of the elliptical acoustics, then you don't need all that sound reinforcement. And that, to me, would be a hallmark of a nice design. Let's see. I heard the decomposed granite where development's going to occur. That makes sense. The design was soft on how water moves down the slopes, and I think that clearly would need a lot of attention in order to be successful. I don't know, a dry well probably wouldn't work too well in this area because as Commissioner Polgar mentioned, it gets pretty soggy. But again, that's a question for the experts, not for me. Let's see. I appreciated the comments about the Creekside Trail that my colleagues raised. I share it. I do think that it would be a real challenge to make this go forward to the west. I appreciate the aspiration, but if I recall the relative zoning in this area, I think it would be a challenge to make it work and not have significant adverse impacts on the species that live in that creek, the protected ones, the listed ones. Cooper's hawks and riparian, Cooper's hawks are raptors. Raptors are protected under our local coastal program as well, so we'd want to be clear about that. I do think that the restoration opportunity is intriguing, and it deserves some thought because there is some non-native things there, and it would be interesting to understand how we could get a net positive from a habitat perspective on this project. So I have an open mind to that, but I'd like to have a lot more clarity than we do right now. Let me see, we've talked about lighting, the chill, handicapped access, ecosystem damage, feasible alternatives. I don't recall the details of the Parks and Recs comments, but I'd be interested at some point when the project comes back, or if they gave us any additional guidance, maybe I just missed it as I was glomming over. But if Parks and Recs had any thoughts about this that you haven't, if they're already incorporated into the thinking of the memo, that's fine. That works for me. It is in a dam inundation zone, so we'd want to have some way to warn people if there were a problem. Sounds like that wouldn't be, but just to err on the side of caution on the safety thing. I think that's it for me. So thank you for bearing with me. Oh, and Commissioner Polgar has some more. Go.
Just to add one thing that observing the site, there does appear to be some erosion from drainage coming off of the properties above. It's from I don't know what exactly is happening, but I'm not sure. That's something just to consider, is that whether that's actually being addressed, because I didn't see, like right now it looks like that area where that erosion is going to be actually under a path, or maybe, so I do think that there's significant kind of drainage issues that might need to be addressed because it's receiving so much water from the properties above. I will say that I do think that there's a good, I am also intrigued by the restoration opportunities. Pilarcitos Creek can be a great anadromous fish habitat, and there's a lot of, I mean, there's some significant downstream issues that have to be dealt with, but there's also work going on upstream already, and so just kind of coordinating with that would be phenomenal. To, you know, it only happens step by step, so that would be exciting to see consideration of that. I don't know how much opportunity on this particular property, considering that the creek is a little offset, so it's not part of this, but just to think about that more broadly, how it would fit in would be wonderful.
Thank you. And Commissioner Reddick, more thoughts?
Well, I'm repeating myself a little bit, but Vice Chair Benjamin was very articulate talking about the issue of the riparian buffer in the storage building when he said it's going to be much easier for me to find a way to go forward with this if we can solve that problem first and foremost.
Thank you. I appreciate your support on that. Commissioner Hernandez, were there any other thoughts from you before we give staff a chance to close this out?
Yeah, I had one other piece of feedback on the Mariners Church project that came before us. There was a bit of contention between various property owners in the adjacent parking area, so I'm sure city staff will take that previous feedback we got into consideration as they do the parking study. But it's an area of concern. It's already been raised by previous projects.
Okay, very good. With that, I think, staff, did you have any closing thoughts that you wanted to share with us?
I wanted to make sure we did a quick sum up, but also to acknowledge Commissioner Polgar's comment about the park entrance. We didn't focus on some of those design features because we knew the environmental components, especially with respect to the creek, were going to be probably dominating the conversation, and we really wanted to spend that time on that. I want you to know and be reassured that the entrance up at Main Street is within the scope of this project. In fact, next to that sign that you bumped into, there's even some kind of a control box. There's a bunch of equipment right there, and it's really needs to be expanded and made great. And the architect understands it. The staff who's working on this project understands it, and you'll see that better developed later. There are a lot of comments about we'd like to see more details. Of course you would, and that's why we're here tonight, to not get too far down the road because we knew there would be these kinds of comments and questions. So some of the key ones in terms of community needs, the ADA parking is really an excellent comment. We've already talked about the entrance, and we'll work on those things, parking in general. There were a range of topics that related to water and erosion from above, below, in the flats, and reminding everybody in the room the park is meant to flood. It's a good thing about that park, and so we need that to be accommodated. And then we will be very clear in the CEQA document that you see with respect to the definition of riparian corridors, riparian buffers, and the potential permitted uses for those. And loud and clear we heard try to get out of the buffer, especially with the stage. It sounds like there's some open-mindedness about a really lightweight trail. The Solidarity Trail has potential. You're worried about lighting there, and I don't think that was ever an intention for it. But beyond that, we understand the scope. That's why nothing else was in a hard line on that plan. So I think everybody in the room who's been working on this project, you've got Parks and Rec people here, and the planners, and of course your project architect, all heard that. So thank you for your thoughtful comments. I know that the project team, most of them are in the back row over there, really appreciate how much time you spent with this and for holding this study session. So thank you.
Thank you. And again, thanks to the public for coming out. Whether you're a super hard enthusiast or you have grave concerns, you added a lot to our meeting tonight. So thank you for that. All right. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have something? Nope. With that, we'll move on to our next item. If there are people who want to slip out go ahead and do it quietly if you can so that we can continue, unless there's a need for a break. The commission will adjourn for 2 minutes for a bio break. We'll be back. Call it 5. Yeah, of course. We'll be back in 5, Rick.
You're not the only one. He just wants to say something to Jill. Nice to see you.
Yeah, always good seeing you. Some good stuff coming up.
Yeah, and I know, well, I live in Cypress Cove. I don't know where they think all those wonderful nature trails are. I'm meeting with Debbie Reddick this weekend about, I want to show her where I live. As they talk about it, it would be right in front of my front door in Cypress Cove. That's what they've talked about. Not just here, not just but when they say they want this nature trail, what, just behind Carter Park, that's pretty small.
No. But are you talking about the trail that the county is doing a study on?
I don't know about anything with the county, but I know that Debbie is going to come over so I can show me. Because they're talking about making Stone Road a possible one, that's been a possible trail. Yeah, where? A narrow sidewalk on one side, and, you know, the paving belly. Anyway, though, people would be walking right by my front door. So I said, please come over, I want you to see. You too. All right, see you.
Oh, you take care. Where's Carol? Where's she go?
She's talking to Jill.
Okay. What's your name? Pat. June.
And what, and you're black.
I'm black.
Yeah, I'm black. No, I should be able to do that.
Carol. I know.
Isn't that funny? Yeah, really.
Take care.
Yeah, I'll take them. If there's any more, you just hand it to Joe and I'll take them. Will do. Okay, again, notes on the back. Thank you, I appreciate that. It helps. You bet. That and watching the videos.
Right.
And the video is up and running. It had a little bit of staff at the beginning, but that's why I was moving around the room to try to fix that. You obviously intimidated the Polycom into working perfectly. Now I worry what'll happen. You ready? You ready? Rick, are you ready?
I am. It's a little noisy. I got reading from my clock.
Okay. I think so.
I think you said something about that.
Thank you, Mike. If we could reconvene, please. Okay, we are back in session, and I think Commissioner Hernandez is back from the slot machines. So we can go on with the next item of business, which is a study session concerning proposed amendments to our zoning code. And I believe that this will be handled by our Community Development Director, Jalikas.
Thank you, Vice Chair Benjamin and Commissioners, and a few folks who are still hanging out. Thanks for doing so. We're happy to bring this to you tonight. The context is important, and we kind of have a two-part presentation where our Deputy City Attorney is going to cover some proposed zoning amendments that are related to housing, specifically affordable housing, and I'm going to be covering a few that are more about the land use side of things and development standards. Background with this is that affordable housing has been a multi-year priority of your City Council. In this fiscal year, from the rural housing side of it, they are focusing on how to use the Affordable Housing Fund most efficiently and how to replenish it. The second one is they wanted to explore community land trusts, and so we've done some research on that for them. And we are also going to do some outreach and pursue tenant protection measures, a little bit adjusted from what we talked to you about a few months back. To help us with that, because our workload is pretty heavy with land use right about now, we've been able to hire a housing consultant who will try to get in here sometime so you can meet Bill Lowell. He's retired from San Mateo County. He was the executive director of the Housing Authority for San Mateo County. So it's just really been incredibly helpful to staff, and he's helping us with all of these items, as well as Sarah Clark, our Deputy City Attorney. Now, in addition to Council's interest in those programs, we ambitiously decided to bring forward some zoning amendments, because in working with the Commission over the last few years and looking at mixed-use projects in particular and some of the challenges of getting them ready for you and having them conform to code, we've noticed a few things over and over again, and it's time to take a look at how the code is working out to be more supportive for housing development in the downtown. And then, of course, the land use plan update continues, and we're making sure that we're paying attention in any zoning amendment that would bring to you, that it be, of course, compatible with both the existing 1996 land use plan as well as the direction that we have right now with our draft land use plan update. So we're going to cover these 5 different topics: the below market rate and density bonus. Sarah's going to go over. I'm going to spend hopefully not too much time talking about parking, and you can give me the hook because I can talk about parking a ridiculously long amount of time. Mixed-use districts and our R2, R3 zoning and multifamily development standards in those. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in, and Sarah's going to start.
Okay, so I'm going to start tonight with both below market rate units, also known as inclusionary zoning, and density bonus. And I think it's important just to take a step back and sort of think about these two things as working together in tandem to address affordable housing issues. So if you think that in land use and zoning we could have both a carrot and a stick, so incentives and both regulation, these are two ways, a carrot way and a stick way of addressing the need for affordable housing. So we start with below market rate or inclusionary zoning ordinances. And this is the stick way. This is the mechanism that the city has to require developers of market rate housing to build affordable housing. And the way that this is accomplished, sort of on a general level, is for every number of market rate units that a developer proposes, they must also provide a certain level of below market rate units. The city does have a below market rate ordinance already. This is highlighted in the box on the far left of this slide. I wanted to say briefly that below market rate ordinances are not required by state law in contrast to density bonuses, which I'll talk about in a moment. It is optional for cities to include them in their zoning ordinances. And there have been some changes in state law over the years about how cities can implement below market rate or inclusionary ordinances, which I'll talk about in a moment. So to cover what the code currently says, it applies generally to proposals that are 10 units or larger. It also very specifically applies only to ownership-only projects, so projects that are intended for sale and not intended for rental development. And the way that it works is that for these larger 10-unit plus projects, the developer is required to build at least 20% of those units as below market rate units. That is a hard percentage, but within that category, there's some flexibility for the types of below market rate units that must be built. So the city's code establishes targets of 7% moderate, 7% low, and 6% very low. I should pause for a moment and just explain moderate, low, and very low are categories of affordable housing that are established and used pretty universally across the country. Oh, great. Jill has handouts on what those numbers actually are. But it's tied to what the area median income is, and the general idea that it is considered affordable for a household to spend no more than 30% of their monthly income on rent or mortgage payments. And so using those calculations is how you can figure out whether someone falls into the category of moderate, low, or very low income households. That's a little bit of background about how the city's code currently works. What we have brought forward for you in the staff report and for your consideration tonight are really three proposed changes to the BMR ordinance, as well as some smaller policy considerations and questions that we wanted to highlight for you. So the first change that we wanted to discuss is reducing the threshold for the BMR ordinance. As I mentioned, this currently applies to projects that are 10 units or more. Planning staff has noticed, and as I'm sure you have noticed, that the majority of projects in Half Moon Bay actually don't make this standard, and so the BMR ordinance is infrequently used. But there have been a number of projects in the past couple of years that have fallen in the 5 to 10 unit threshold, and so there is a proposal for your consideration to reduce that threshold down to 5 units or more. This is in line with a number of other jurisdictions in San Mateo County and in the Bay Area. Jurisdictions, because there's flexibility, have done different things, but there certainly are a number of jurisdictions that have BMR ordinances that apply to projects of this smaller size. So that's the first thing for discussion on the table today. The second thing I wanted to discuss is the qualification that our current ordinance only applies to ownership-only projects. That was in part because there had been some inconsistency or lack of clarity in state law about the ability of jurisdictions to apply BMR ordinances to rental projects. There had been a case in 2015 called Palmer, which actually held that BMR ordinances that that applied to rental units conflicted with the Costa-Hawkins Act, which relates to rent control. But in 2017, the state legislature reversed that decision and said that jurisdictions are permitted to apply BMR ordinances to rental properties. And since 2017, we have seen a number of jurisdictions throughout San Mateo County and the Bay Area modify their BMR ordinances to apply to rental properties. And so the second item for your consideration tonight is expanding the code in a similar fashion to apply to these rental properties. And then finally, the third sort of major policy item we wanted to talk about is the percentage requirements that the code has. And this comes really for two reasons. I think that city staff has brought this potential change forward. The first is there is an aspect of state law that says that jurisdictions cannot amend or update their BMR ordinances if the BMR ordinance applies to require more than 15% production of units for affordable housing. If the jurisdiction has not yet met its targets for above moderate RHNA housing production. And Jill and I did the calculations, and we are like right on the cusp, like potentially right like within one unit. And this in part depends on how we're counting production of above moderate units. And so Jill and I plan to talk to HCD about whether this threshold actually would apply to the city and whether we would be prohibited from updating our ordinance unless we drop down to this threshold. But because this might be the case, we would like this to be up for your consideration. The other item is that based on work that has been done for San Mateo County, there's actually some concern that having a 20% requirement actually makes some projects unaffordable for developers to develop, that the 20% is simply too much of a cost burden on developers. And so there are a number of jurisdictions that have dropped down to 15% production requirements for below market rate units. And so that's definitely something that we want to consider as well. The other thing that has been brought to our attention primarily from Bill Lowell, who Jill mentioned, is the different ways that the BMR ordinance should apply to rental production versus ownership production. So one thing that Bill has brought to our attention is really that BMR ordinances are one of the few tools that cities can use to direct towards the production of moderate ownership housing. And that this has been referred to as sort of the missing middle, the housing for firefighters, teachers, that sort of thing. And so a number of jurisdictions, when considering targets, have looked at really directing more of the below market rate units to moderate and low in the ownership category. On the flip side of that, we know that very low and low rental options are quite important and are a missing subset of the accommodations that are required. And so we have proposed here sort of different targets for different types of proposals, whereby we would have a target of 7% moderate and 8% low for the ownership option, and then a target of 7% low and 8% very low for the rental option. Again, these are targets, and they can be modified by the Planning Commission and City Council upon a project approval, but something for us to consider. There are two other items that I wanted to bring to your attention just as policy considerations when we're talking about the below market rate ordinance. The first is that in making those findings for whether the targets apply, the city's current code just says that the city can modify them based on specifics of each new project, which is not a very helpful finding. And so we would look for input from the Planning Commission on what findings perhaps would better elucidate what we should be thinking about in making that modification. And then the second thing to talk about too is when we have a five-unit project, it's very often the case that we only have one unit being produced. So we wouldn't get one moderate and one low, we would just get one. And so we'd like to provide direction to developers about which one of those categories they would need to produce in. And you'll see here that we have recommendations for first unit being low for those ownership, and then first unit being very low for those rental options. Again, you could have that be a flexible standard or a directive, but something for Planning Commission to consider. So that's my presentation on the BMR ordinance. These are the policy considerations, sorry, that I just talked through. Sure, Jill's gonna add something.
I'm going to add a little bit of the practice of what happens on staff side of the counter when we're working with housing developers and we're rolling out some of these codes right now under the 20% with the moderate, low, very low. And they see the specifics of my project. Oh, I love the moderate. I'll do the moderate. Yes, thank you for the moderate. And won't you support that, staff? And it's really challenging to not have enough foundation for the findings and, frankly, to have that much range in what the units are. So I think it's important to leave the door open, of course, for you and the City Council are policymakers and decision makers on these things, so you have options. But that said, it's really helpful to have some clarity with that first sitting down at the counter meeting with somebody and being real firm about what we're expecting. And so even though this looks like it might be a bit of a drop, by dropping the threshold, this is a very sort of direct type of proposal. And you'll notice in attachment 2 of your staff report is a summary that the City of San Mateo just put together for, they're looking at the same thing, and they looked at the jurisdictions in San Mateo County and Santa Clara County. So you can see some of them have a split between how they did rental and ownership, and others don't.
So before we go on to talk about density, I mean, this is such an involved topic. I wonder if it makes sense for us to spend a few minutes talking about the below market rate and then continue with the density conversation. That gives the public a chance to speak on both topics while we have our head clear. If there's something more, by all means.
Yeah, I would encourage you perhaps to have clarifying questions now, then cover density bonus, clarifying questions, public comment on those, if there is any, and then discussion?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay.
If there's no objection. Okay, any clarifying questions? You have your finger on the button, Commissioner Polgar.
Didn't quite there.
Go for it.
Okay, I have a rather, I'm embarrassed to ask this, but I'm assuming, so clearly if it's 15% and it's a 5 unit, it's one of them, and then, but the same, so if it's a 10 unit, it would actually still be 2 units, right? No? Am I not understanding? Because would you round up or you round down, or how does it,
So
there's probably a percentage?
Yeah, there's rounding specified in the city's code, and we propose to leave that in place. The way that it works is if you do your percentage and you end up with a number that's like 1.6, something that's above 1.5, you round up and require building of those units. If it's a number that is below the 0.5 threshold, so say it's 1.3, you would build 1 unit and then pay a fee to cover that 0.3 to make up for it, but you would not build that second unit. And so it depends on how the calculations work out. Is that how?
That's exactly right, and it relates to why we're suggesting that the first unit be the deeper affordability level, because council really likes to have the partial unit be a unit and not money. And so if the second unit isn't quite as hard of a hit, it's possible that we can work with developers to do that second unit. So it looks simple, but there were quite a few thoughts that went into that suggestion.
And just for the mathematicians among us, if your calculation works out right at 1.5, are you rounding up or are you writing a check?
I believe the way the city's code written is that you round up.
Thank
So it's 1.5 and up.
Okay, thanks. More? Nope. How about you, Steve?
Do I understand correctly that you recommend reducing the BMR amount from 20% to 15% only if the state requires that?
I think that's something that we want to talk about with HCD and perhaps do a little bit further research on the question of feasibility of continuing to require 20%. Some of the evidence we've seen suggests that 20% simply isn't feasible for developers. So that's something that we're going to continue to look at, and we'll bring back to you when we come forward with an actual proposed ordinance. But welcome your thoughts on the differences between those two at this point in time.
Well, my gut reaction is that 20% works better for us to put our policies into practice and make a difference. But I wouldn't be blind to the market realities if you end up doing that research and come up with a different point of view.
Let's hear from the public before we get too far down that road. But were there any other clarifying questions? Commissioner Hernandez, did you have some clarifying questions for us tonight on this?
No clarifying questions, but I support the 20% thought that Roddick has laid out.
Were you guys able to hear that? Okay, great. I'm sorry, Commissioner Polgar? Of course.
I'm not very knowledgeable, and I may have been in here, but I wanted to understand, so for below market rate housing, whether it's ownership or rental, is it in perpetuity, it stays below market rate, or is it have an expiration? Because I remember, I can't find it now, but I remember there was one of the, I've lost track of where it was, but there was some proposal about increasing how long the affordability measures applied, and I wasn't sure if that's for this as well.
The city's housing element has a policy to seek new affordable housing agreements for this type of units to be in perpetuity. The 55-year term that you saw in the staff report applies to the density bonus, and you'll hear about that in a second, and Sarah can explain why. 55 years is really good. If you can get in perpetuity, obviously you're going to go for it, but to get 55 years is often the better part of the useful life of a unit, and there's a number of things that a city will put into an affordable housing agreement, like first right of refusal and abilities to buy down units when the agreement is coming towards its term. But we have a policy to support in perpetuity, so that's what we're trying to get out of our agreements.
The city's code right now just requires an agreement to be in place and have that agreement recorded against the property. That's something that we could also clean up in this proposed revisions to the BMR ordinance to perhaps add a term that matches the density bonus or that is in perpetuity, as Jill said.
So if I might, one of the things that seems curious to me about the way below market rate housing works in conjunction with the natural order of development. Development, except for condos and things like that don't involve subdivisions, typically is an iterative process. You have a large tract of land and it gets subdivided into pieces, and then some of those pieces may be big enough that they get subdivided again later. And if I were, we have nothing but the best developers in Half Moon Bay. But if I were not from Half Moon Bay and I wanted to develop, I could imagine having a parcel and wanting to put, let's say, 10 houses on it. And I could subdivide in such a way that I created 5 parcels and say, oh, or 9 parcels, we'll say, some number below the threshold, whatever your BMR threshold is, pursue those. You know, you have limited capital. You're not going to develop them all at once anyway. And you've got this other unused parcel of land that you're not working with. And then when those are done, you do another one. And it's also under the threshold. And as a result of this iterative process, it seems like the way our ordinance is designed, it can be gamed to avoid applicability. And I wonder if there's some potential, or maybe it's already there and I just don't understand it, for assessing the cumulative number of units that's going to be developed without going too far. That's kind of a question, I think.
I think practically we don't have that many pieces of property that would present that way. And most of them that are in a larger area with development potential are in a planned development and would require a specific plan. So you'd have a lot of control over making sure that you got BMR requirements out of all of the units. Most of the work that we're doing now, as you know, is infill, small sites. There's no room to subdivide again. It may be a case, the biggest parcels I can think of where maybe this could happen would be with straight up zoning would be a redevelopment of a shopping center. And I'll keep thinking. I can't think of corner cases. That's the only one I can come up with.
Yeah, well,
okay.
And then just to follow up on Commissioner Ruddick's question, in terms of understanding, not necessarily to express the preference because we need to hear from the public, but just to understand what seems to have worked and what hasn't yet. If we were to track the way that the BMR ordinance had applied, would we just get flat zeros, or would we say, if we had these 15% threshold, these lower thresholds and the 50% BMRs, and that had been applied, you know, do we know that we would have done better with the history? Do we think we will do better in the future? I infer from your recommendation that you think we do.
I think you'd be pretty close to even, but that said, let's talk a little bit about ownership housing with BMR ordinance and the struggle with that. Very low and even low sometimes for ownership housing, other than for Habitat for Humanity, is incredibly difficult to find a qualified buyer. We're talking about a household that's in the income categories that on the handout that I shared with you. By the way, for the good of the group, I somehow left half my handouts on my desk. This is off the San Mateo County Housing website. It's the rent limits for the, based on the area median income for 2019. Stunningly, the area median income is about $136,000. And you'll see that what happens with moderate is still pretty expensive units. But once you get down into the low and very low, that's really an area where the rental housing is working much better, the affordable housing. For ownership, to have the buyer qualified at that level and to have a down payment is profoundly unusual. In the days of redevelopment and putting those kinds of projects together, things had to be done like silent second mortgages to accomplish the down payment, forgiveness of loans to accomplish that. And so that's the other reason why this is skewed a little bit. And so why I picked on this is you asked how we're doing a little bit. And with respect to 3 different projects that are ownership projects, we haven't gotten any units yet. We won't get any out of the Carnoustie project, phase 1 through 3, directly in the project. That project went into a development agreement and they chose to pay the in lieu fee, and council approved that. So you did get a really nice bump in your affordable housing fund. The Creekside project, we still haven't entered into an affordable housing agreement, and it's hard to get down to some of those levels. And so we're looking at how to do rental units in the ownership project to accomplish the left-hand column. And then the other one is the project on Metzger and Main. It's a subdivision in the R2 zone. We do have an affordable housing agreement in place. The property's for sale. I'm not sure how it's going to come in. So it's not really tested for the ownership projects. You do have rental that has come through this way. Most of the city's affordable housing, however, was developed by affordable housing developers, nonprofits, who continue to own and manage those projects. There's about 400 units of it. It's a full 25% of your rental inventory is deed-restricted affordable units, which is really notable.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Any other questions from you, Commissioner Hernandez? Anything from you?
No.
All right then. We'll open the public hearing for hearing about below market rate. It's open. I have one green card, which may or may not involve market rate. I'll call Mike Ferreira. Is your mic on? I'm not. Your booming voice usually shakes the room, so. Is the light on, Mike?
Okay. We support the 20% limit because, according to our studies, if you don't do 20%, you lose ground because new market rate housing actually generates employment needs for people that can't afford to live in that new housing. And so I approve of what you're trying to do. The 1 and the 55-year thing I think is a great idea. It's probably more practical than trying to get perpetuity. One thing I'm wondering if it's possible to get into your thinking is the size of those 20% units. And a minimum size that would have to come up, and or what relationship that size would have to be to the other units, because you don't want to get a tiny house as the affordable unit. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one other green sheet. Greg Jameson, welcome.
Good evening. My name is Greg Jameson. I want to talk a little bit about the affordable aspect of this, and I'm concerned about obviously trying to create as much affordable housing as we can in the city, and I look at it from a developer's aspect and also the costs involved with construction and permits and all. But one of the things I'm concerned about is under the rental option, using a hypothetical situation. Let's say you were to develop 10 duplexes, and that's 10 individual lots, and you apply, let's say, 20% for the BMR. That means 4 units would be required within the project. And one of my concerns is that when those 4 units are, when you apply those units be applied to 2 of the lots specifically. So 2 affordable units on one lot, 2 affordable on the other. And one of the concerns there is when you're doing the nonprofits, when they operate these, they're able to get tax exemptions for the property taxes. So if one lot is worth, if you build a duplex and it's worth $1.2 million, your tax exemption is, $12,000 a year. That's $1,000 a month. It makes it a lot more affordable to whoever's going to be living there. So for a developer, if he's going to operate it as a nonprofit, he can do that. It's a very time-consuming and expensive, but you may want to either dedicate it to a nonprofit, the land, and then they're able to build it. And under those conditions, you can make rents a lot cheaper for the individuals who are trying to do that for. Thank you.
Thank you. No other green sheets on this? All right. Let's see. Do you want to discuss this now, or do you want to continue to talk? Let's talk about density then. All right. Carry on. I'll leave the public hearing open, just since it's hard to bang the gavel a lot.
Bridget left. Oh, there we go. I don't know, but now we're not where we need to be. Oh, goodness. Here, I can talk if you want to continue working on that. Okay, we're going to switch to density bonus. So this is the flip side of below market rate units in two ways. One, this is the carrot. So this is incentives for developers to build affordable housing units, not requirements. The other flip side of this is that this is heavily dictated by state law. So the state has a density bonus provision in state law, in the government code, and it already applies in the city of Half Moon Bay. So the way that the city's code is drafted is that developers have the opportunity to either go through the city's code as existing or to select state law options. And so to the extent that the state law is inconsistent with the city's code, which it is in a number of respects right now, developers already have the choice to move forward with the density bonus provisions under state law. So that's an important thing to note that is really distinct from the BMR ordinance that we just discussed. So with respect to the density bonus ordinance in the city's code, it was last amended in 2010, and since that there has been at least 4 major amendments to the state's density bonus laws. And our proposed amendments to the density bonus code are really to bring the city's code into conformance with state laws to create additional clarity for developers and for others seeking to move forward with a density bonus project. And so I wanted to talk with you about some of the more significant changes that state law has already brought to this arena and how we might amend the ordinance to address those issues. And then there are a couple of places where the city does retain some policy discretion to make specific tweaks or modifications, and so I'm going to talk about a couple of those with you as well. So first, I know this is a question that comes up, and I just wanted to address it right off the bat. So the density bonus law has a specific provision related to the Coastal Act. And this has gone through some iterations. Again, there was a court case, and then there was a response by the state legislature. Where we are now is that cities with land in the coastal zone are directed to make their density bonus ordinances consistent with both the state law and to the Coastal Act to the extent possible. And where I think this really comes down is that the cities are not permitted to have general rejections of density bonus projects based on, a general feeling about whether density is allowed under the LCP or more general provisions. However, if there are specific inconsistencies between a project and the Coastal Act or the city's LCP, specific, where there's specific standards, things like that, then that can come into play. So it's a balancing act that has to be addressed on a project-by-project basis, but there are mechanisms in state law to acknowledge the Coastal Act and to ensure that we don't have projects moving forward that do create a clear inconsistency with either the Coastal Act policies or cities' adopted LCPs. The second thing that I wanted to mention is there is a change, as Commissioner Polgar brought up, to the terms. So our current code references that projects have to have a 30-year term. state law now requires a 55-year term, and so we would be suggesting amendments to bring that into conformance. In addition, the state law now has what's called a development bonus for the commercial components of a mixed-use project, or projects where a commercial developer is partnering with an affordable housing provider to provide commercial on one site and affordable housing on another site. I will note that this area of state law is quite confusing and in some ways vague, but the intent is really to allow commercial developers to take advantage of density bonuses when they're partnering with affordable housing developers, such that they get sort of the benefits of these state law provisions when what they're doing is, channeling funding into affordable housing elsewhere. How that works on the ground has led to some problems, but we will do our best to make our code clear in this regard. Other changes to state laws, these are less important or less substantial changes, but I wanted to run through them quickly anyway. Density bonus provisions have now been expanded to apply to a number of other types of projects, including projects for transitional foster youth, disabled veterans, homeless persons, and lower income students. These types of projects may not come up in the city as much, particularly the students one, but we want to make sure that we're recognizing these kinds of projects as eligible under state law. There's also reduced parking requirements now mandated for projects that involve seniors or special needs housing. It's a reduction in parking ratios, so we'll include those as well. This next one is interesting. So the density bonus law, I should have mentioned earlier, what it does is it says if you build a certain number of affordable housing units, and it has a number of different categories, then you get a certain amount of density bonus for the rest of your market rate project. It also has components that relate to what are known as incentives and concessions. These are granting changes to development standards or other things that might make the project work better or pencil out better for the developer. For each amount of affordable housing you produce, you get 1 incentive or 2 incentive or 3 incentives. The third thing that state law does is it says that if there are development standards that would make it infeasible for a developer to build the project with the affordable housing, then they can also request waivers or reductions in those development standards. And so we would add provisions to have that process in place in the city and make very clear that you could not have a waiver or reduction of required Coastal Act policies or required provisions of the LCP. And I think it's important for us to include that particular language to make sure that folks are clear that that's how that applies in the city, which is different from if you just read the state law code. And then finally, there's a change in state law related to replacement or elimination of existing affordable units. So you don't want folks to get density bonus laws if they're knocking down a bunch of affordable units and then reconverting them. So those are some of the changes that we'll be bringing forward in a revised density bonus ordinance. The areas of policy consideration that I wanted to bring to your attention and open up for your consideration are threefold. So first, our existing code allows granting of a density bonus when a developer converts existing rental housing into ownership housing. This is not required by state law. It's something that our code does that is unique. And we have a policy question as to whether we want to actually incentivize that type of conversion from rental to ownership. I mean, I don't know if that is something that is necessarily problematic, but query whether it's worth granting pretty significant incentives to developers to do that. Second is, I mentioned these, the incentives and concessions that developers can have. The city has in its existing code incentives for when developers build farm worker housing, and it's just for a specific level of farm worker housing you get 2 concessions. And this is on top of state law. It's not a provision of state law. It's just something that the city has required. And so one thing to look at is whether we might want to expand the scope of that incentives and concessions that are being granted, or whether perhaps we want to reduce it or otherwise modify it. And then finally, there was a change to state law in 2015 related to child care facilities on industrial or commercial projects. Cities now have the option of granting density bonuses for such projects. I should note that the state law and the city's code already grant incentives for developers to build child care facilities in conjunction with residential projects. This was sort of created as an add-on. And so one thing, if you'd like, we could look at having this type of density bonus for child care facilities that are built in conjunction with these other uses. So those are the 3 density bonus policy considerations for you to look at tonight. And with that, I will stop on density bonus and see if you have any clarifying questions.
Do we have any clarifying questions? Commissioner Ruddick.
Thank you. Do we have a point of view on what the impact of the farm worker housing incentives have been in Half Moon Bay?
Not off the top of our head. Jill says she's not aware of us using them. We could look into it further back and see.
Commissioner Polgar.
I had a question about, and maybe it somewhat relates to Commissioner Benjamin's comment earlier, or question about what happened. I guess I'm wondering about the sequencing, because I was wondering if there's some kind of policy or law related to specifics, for instance, to the commercial partnership with affordable housing, and how I'm wondering, when you come up with a situation like that, where how do you know? I mean, because it could be years and years and years that you wait to get one part of the project done, and is it usually that the state law requires that the affordable part be built, or that doesn't necessarily seem like maybe it could be it may not be feasible for developers to do that. So it came up, and I don't know if it's that relevant to all of these, necessarily, but I could see where you're kind of trying to do your density bonus, you get your density bonus, what part goes first? And, if it's a really big development, which I guess we probably won't have something like that necessarily, but I just am wondering, maybe that's like the devil's in the details and it's too far down.
No, not at all. Those are great questions. So generally speaking, when a developer comes forward with a density bonus project and gets the additional density for their market rate units and the concessions and incentives that they have applied, the way that the law works is there are requirements then to make sure that the the affordable units are actually built at the same time. So there's not like a lag between getting to build all your market rate housing and then having that affordable housing happen sometime in the future. With respect to the commercial and residential partnership projects, this is one of the criticisms of the sort of vagueness in state law. The way that ordinance is drafted, however, the city is required to enter into an agreement related to how that is all supposed to work, and I think that those details are supposed to be worked out in the agreement itself, so that that you can have that appropriate sequencing and make sure, again, that you don't get your benefits before that the developer doesn't get his or her benefits before the city gets theirs.
Commissioner Hernandez, did you have any clarifying questions about this topic, the density bonus?
I'm good. Thank you.
Sounds like he's winning. I had a couple of questions. And first of all, I want to say this has been a really fun staff report on what could be potentially a very contentious item, because you've anticipated a lot of my questions, for which I thank you. I'm going to poke a little bit, so bear with me. Since the staff report helpfully pointed out the sections of the government code that were relevant, as you might expect, I went out and read it. It is Byzantine. And I found this section that says, as you pointed out, this section, referring to the density bonus stuff, does not supersede or in any way alter or lessen the effect or application of the California Coastal Act of 1976 and with respect to density bonuses, concessions, incentives, waivers or reductions, parking ratios. It'll all be permitted in a manner that is consistent with this section and Division 20. So we're being called to harmonize it. I think I get it. And then a little further down, there's text that says the granting of a concession or an incentive shall not require or be interpreted in and of itself to require a general plan amendment, local coastal plan amendment, zoning change, study, or other discretionary approval. And I have the citations if somebody actually wants them. But that second one I was struggling with a little bit, because depending on how you want to read it, that could say, and we're going to grant these, and you can't, someone who doesn't like them can say, I don't want, I don't accept that that would require an amendment. Even though without this language it would, it says that you can't require that. You just have to close your eyes and say yes. Or it can be read in isolation as saying, don't grant something that would require these things. Don't grant them. Which one?
Yeah, a little bit of a middle ground, I think, if I understand your characterization appropriately. The way this language is actually mirrored in a number of different statutes related to housing. And what it is saying, so let's, for instance, use a parking example. So say someone comes in and they have the city's parking requirements, and they want to use their incentive to reduce the parking. Otherwise, that would require a discretionary parking exemption to be sought from the Planning Commission and approved. And what this is saying is that this is an item that is part of the granting of the density bonus, and so you don't need that specific approval just for that particular item. What it doesn't do is remove the discretionary approvals from the remainder of the project. You're still going to have to do your standard approvals if it's a subdivision or you need a CDP or anything like that. It's just saying that in and of itself, the granting of an incentive or waiver doesn't require an additional discretionary approval.
So if someone were to come along and say, my density bonus is going to be applied to get me a little bit more units, or a little more square footage, and you know what, that square footage is going to go into a riparian corridor, and you can't make me not do that. And we can say au contraire. We can insist on compliance with the LCP, yes?
Yeah, yes, because it's a requirement of the LCP. To pose a slightly different hypothetical, if someone says, I want to go into the setbacks, and those setbacks aren't related to the LCP, they're just standard site setbacks, then you wouldn't need a variance to do that.
That's tricky because our setbacks are part of the zoning ordinance, and the zoning ordinance is also our implementation plan.
Yes.
So it's kind of maybe not the perfect example, but I get the idea.
Yeah, we're in a unique situation in Half Moon Bay where everything is part of our LCP.
Yeah, maybe if it were about parks or something, sidewalks. Okay, here's another one. There's a section, for a lot of this, these policies for density seem to be tied to proximity to a major transit stop. And there's a citation of another, so I'm looking at 165915.7. This was just for illustration, not to be exhaustive. It was talking about commercial development partnerships with affordable housing through a partner housing coalition. And it talks about housing under, one of the conditions is that it's located within a half mile of a major transit stop, pursuant to a different section of the Public Resources Code. So of course I went to that section of the Public Resources Code, and it said that it had to also include major, it defined them in section 21064.3, which said the site contained an existing rail transit station or a ferry terminal served by either a bus or rail transit service, or the intersection of two or more major bus routes with a frequency of service interval of 15 minutes or less during the morning and afternoon peak commute periods. Now, of course, those things can change over time, So maybe they don't apply today, or maybe it does. Can you tell me whether that stuff actually applies to us?
Yeah, we've evaluated it and do not believe that it applies at this time. The proposals and discussions that I brought up in the staff report and in this presentation tonight are only those that don't rely on being within a half mile of a major transit site. So for instance, the code section that you just read says housing shall be constructed on the site of the commercial development or on a site that is all of the following. And so we would believe that that other site would not apply in the city of Half Moon Bay. And instead, a proposal under this part of the code would only apply if it's on the site of the commercial development.
Okay, yeah, I did not try to decode this because I want a life, and you're the expert. But when this comes back to us, one thing that was not clear to me, and I'm not suggesting deception or something, it wasn't clear to me, was what are the things that we're being asked to do that just make our code consistent with the state law, and what are the things that we think would be good things to do in addition to that, because it's Half Moon Bay.
Sure.
If you know that now, that's great. If you don't.
Yes. So the items that I brought forth on the first two slides that are labeled state law changes, those are all things that are required to make our code consistent with state law. This last policy consideration slide are optional things for your consideration, not required by state law. And I also want to be clear that you don't have to change your code. As the code is written, you already are giving developers the option to go to the state law instead, so that these changes are in effect already in place in Half Moon Bay. Staff is just suggesting making this code to make it clear for all folks how exactly these are intended to apply.
Right, and I'm trying to make it clear for me, because it was, I get that state law says these apply, whether you think they apply or not, we're telling you they apply in some cases. I was just a little vague about which ones applied, so your slide is helpful for that. Yeah, I think it's time, rather than go on with more questions, I'd rather hear from the public again. So I didn't pick up any new green cards, but I'm wondering if the members of the public would like to speak to this item again. So, Mr. Ferreira, welcome back.
Commissioner Benjamin, I have a bit of curiosity on the density bonus, because we dealt with that somewhat on Wavecrest Village, and it seemed even a long time ago that was a bit of magical thinking, because you demand 20%, they give you the 20%, then they get X percent over that, so you're no longer getting 20%. And it almost says that if you really want 20%, maybe you have to ask for something higher. That's what I'll say.
Thank you. Mr. Jameson, nothing new?
I would just be curious to know how this would apply to an R3 project. Are we just talking single family and duplex, or how would an R3 project be treated as far as density?
Okay, so rather than close the public hearing, since my arm is still tired, let's leave it open and continue the conversation. Does staff want to reply to the members of the public?
Sure. Yeah, you do that.
All right, one thing that I think is relevant to the R3 is, and any of the zoning districts where this is being sought, is each zone has a density range that's allowed in it. So just for round numbers, the top for the R3 is about 30%, or 30 dwelling units to the acre, excuse me. And a maximum density bonus is usually 35%. So let's just say that's about 10 more DUs per the acre. So a project that qualifies for a density bonus, a 35% density bonus on an R3 site, if it was big enough to support that many units, could have a build out of 40 units to the acre on that property, and that is not deemed to be inconsistent. Sorry for the double negative. That is still consistent with your code. We are not in a place where we would have to rezone or come up with some other kind of way to accommodate that density.
And not because we're looking the other way, it's because our R3 zone already accommodates that?
No, it's because you're not supposed to count the extra density in that way, that you wouldn't penalize a project to make it have a variance if they were seeking a setback
Okay,
as one
and
of their
if
concessions.
if I can modify the question slightly, suppose we weren't talking about zoning, suppose we were talking about land use designation density, would it be the same?
Yes.
Same thing.
And you know, I do want to note, as we've been working on our land use plan, and of course the subcommittee knows as well, that we've been really careful about what the base densities are in the different parts of town and not raising them too high, because we anticipate density bonuses being invoked in some places, and we're trying to maintain a building form that is consistent with what we need to be doing because of our Coastal Act requirements, especially with regards to visual resources in some cases.
Yeah, so, and then a comment on the, perhaps you'd like to respond to Mr. Ferrer's thoughts as well.
Hang on a second. Well, I wrote down.
Or if you'd like more elaboration.
I wrote down sketchy notes about Wavecrest Village.
There's so few of
So I
us
need
here
a little
tonight.
help.
In the interest, yeah, please, the hearing is still open, and this is why.
We're getting
So-
till 10.
At this point, we can have a
It's
conversation.
mathematical statement that if he comes in and he says, I want 100 units, okay, so 20
Yeah, yeah.
are affordable, and then he gets X number, then in the aggregate, you no longer have 20.
I can respond to that.
That's the
Yeah.
problem, so that if 20 was the target, then maybe you need to set something higher than 20. That's
Thank you for reminding us of your
Thank you very
helpful
much.
comment. So just to quickly respond to that, what Mr. Farrar is referring to is the fact that the density bonus ordinance and the below market rate ordinance work in tandem with one another. So we, as a city, are requiring developers to make certain amounts of their projects affordable. Under state law, they then qualify for a density bonus because they've made certain aspects of their projects affordable. And there's nothing in state law that exempts those units from qualifying just because the city is the one that required them to be built in the first place. So what that means is, to take the example, you have a 100-unit project. It builds at it qualifies, let's say, with our current ordinance, 20% of those are affordable. You look at the requirements, depending on what level of affordability, they would get a density bonus on top of this. And so in reality, what they would ultimately build is 110 units or 120 units, depending, and 20% of those would be affordable. So that's how those two things would work in tandem, and you take that percentage from the beginning, not from the ultimate number of units that are built.
So if I understood the thinking correctly, it sort of confirms what he was saying, which was that they'd end up building 100 market rate units and the 20% that are affordable are just on top of the 100 rather than part of the 100.
Yes, that's correct. And
Okay.
so we can think about changing the targets based on that information. And it's kind of like a sliding scale, though, the way that it works,
right. Well,
because of state law's requirement that you don't count those density bonus units towards your BMR.
I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. I've got to remember that I'm chairing tonight, so forgive me for engaging. Colleagues, that was all of the green sheets I'd had, and I don't know if anybody else wants to speak. So seeing no one, I wonder if you'd like to comment on this before we move on, or maybe this time I'll start with Commissioner Hernandez. Rick?
I'm good.
That was very succinct. Commissioner Polgar?
Well, you had asked, I think one of the areas of policy consideration had to do with the existing code, which grants the density bonuses, but not for rentals,
For conversion.
no, sorry, yes, for conversion. Wouldn't want to see that change, because I think right now, basically, it's not, it's essentially trying to prevent rentals from being converted into ownership. And is that right? Is that the?
No, it's giving an incentive for folks to convert from rental into ownership.
Oh, I misunderstood that. So, okay.
So it's saying if you convert into ownership.
Then I don't want to see that. I'm based on the information from, that in reading this and the report, and then also what you had to say. I don't know that that's a good incentive. So I would be in favor of changing that to in favor of keeping rentals as rentals. So, because I don't think that's an appropriate density bonus, as long as we have leeway.
Thank you. Commissioner Reddick.
I agree with Commissioner Polgar on that point. I think that it's more inclusive, and it's a superset of folks can be benefited if we do not encourage rental units to be converted.
Anything else? Okay, I had a few things here. So first, I appreciate the example that Mike brought to the conversation and the clear answer that we got from staff. That was great. And it really speaks to the fact that we've got to back solve for the densities that we want to target. When I look at the proposals in the, well, whether we're talking about the current LCP or things in the new LCP, I can think of more than a few places where this could have an impact. I'm struggling to recall specific language in our planned development districts, our PDs, that require this kind of development as part of the benefit to the city. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm saying I'm a civ head. So it's there, great. And then there are some, and again, I think when we were talking about the densities in that area with respect to what we want, anticipating that those are going to be loaded up with, they're going to qualify for more density because of the density bonus. I want to be sure we're hitting the place we want to go in, that we think that makes sense. So let's be sure that as we go through the process, and I know that in Appendix B, where we've done the analysis, we've talked about those, but we probably all ought to go back and have a good look, because this sort of highlights the ramifications of this way of thinking and how they might change if we think about this differently. Also, we have language in the about workforce housing, and my impression is, if we haven't called that explicitly affordable housing, in my mind at least, that's the raison d'etre. And so I would expect it to be that, which means it's going to ring all the bells for density bonuses, because it's basically 100%, low or very low kind of housing. So again, I want to back solve so that we get to the place that we targeted, rather than go forward with a nominal density and then suddenly, surprise, it's, X% more than that. So I would like to address that. Let's see, with respect to the commercial-private developer relationship, that type of development seems a little unique to me, because first of all, the positive is that it provides access to some deep pockets. I get it. Yeah. On the other hand, as with a lot of other development in our country, as opposed to just Half Moon Bay, I worry about the project, unless we've really thought through the total cost of ownership and maintenance of the project over the life of the project, as opposed to the cost of construction, that the developer, well-intentioned, well within the confines of the law, does the right things by our laws. The project is completed, they get an occupancy certificate, he gets his tax credit certificate, and then the project has ownership, maintenance, management costs, right? And maybe the well-intentioned housing partner doesn't have the resources to pull it off. what happens then? Is there some provision within the law, within state law, that would allow us to say we need to somehow bond for performance, so that we actually know that we realize the effects over the lifetime of the project? And I do like the longer lifetimes. I remember the conversation with the developer of Ocean Colony. Who was that? Pat Fitzgerald, many years ago. He was involved in one of our affordable housing projects, and he was coming in with a 30-year project, and I remember jawboning him into a perpetuity. And initially he said, why would I do that? I said, well, then, looking now, the net present value, the discounted value coming back 30 years for that additional infinity of time is decimal dust for you. And he looked at it and said, oh yeah, you're right. So my suggestion is, rather than waiting until we get near the end of the period to try to get the perpetuity, it seems like, a very clear-eyed, decimal dust calculation that says, here's the NPV value of extending that. They're going to be surprised how low it is, because 30 years of discounted value actually drops the number a lot. So I'd like to think that we can go long on that. Let's see, what other comments on density? I concur with my colleagues that I think for the demographics that we're trying to serve in our housing, I feel that the rental in the very low market is the right target for us, and I would not encourage the continuation of the transition. To me, the transition to ownership it also makes it a little more difficult, and maybe infeasible, to track the affordability. And one of the principles that I think we should be using in general with achieving development in town is where we intend to get some public good from a project, we need to make it permanent, right? Because if it's temporary, then at some point in the future, a different staff and planning commission is facing the same problem we're facing tonight, but with fewer resources, because the city of Half Moon Bay isn't necessarily getting bigger. In fact, with sea level rise, it's probably getting smaller. So I feel like our interests are better served by playing the long game. We need to remember that most of our constituents and our stakeholders have not been born yet. Let's see, we haven't talked about parking yet, so maybe that's the next topic of conversation. Oh, Commissioner Polgar, more, please.
In terms of there's a couple other things that you had asked for kind of input on, or that seemed like there were policy considerations, and one was the farm worker housing incentives. And I do see the value of increasing incentives. I think there's an example of providing an incentive for maybe a lower number of housing. And I think that's valuable in considering like some of the newer farm, it may not be such large scale, and so having the capacity for maybe a smaller farming operation to offer farm worker housing and having the incentives apply. I think that could be a very positive outcome. I also, just having commiserated and having gone through in the recent past, not that recent, but in terms of trying to find childcare, I do think that there is a lack of childcare services in our community, and so I'm not sure I entirely understand how the childcare facility bonus would work, in terms of all the details, but overall, it's a need. So I would be in favor of some sort of, incentive some way to incentivize that.
And I'd like to understand, there's some projection of what the need is. I'm not disputing whether there is or not, but I think it would be nice to document it. As you said, I think we have some facilities associated with residential development. I think that was what you said earlier.
I said there's incentives available
Incentives,
for them.
but not
I don't know if
necessarily realized.
They exist, yeah.
Okay. I seem to remember there being a facility in Pilocito Station. Am I all wet about that? Maybe that was there and closed. Maybe that was before your time.
I do think documenting the need is important. I don't think you'll have a hard time doing that. There's waiting lists.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting it doesn't exist.
And no, I just think that it is a need, and I don't necessarily think that it's fully realized in residential for sure.
So there's a fairly recent needs assessment study for San Mateo County that indicates that not only is the county in real serious need for childcare, but the coast is worse. And it's in particular for affordability levels that are important to this community. It's a study that I think we were talking about with the GPAC back in like 2016. I can see if it's been updated. I would doubt that has a different result. It's really, staff didn't come in with recommendations on what this slide is about, but we'd be happy to opine a little bit about it. Right now, I think we're really appreciating the direction that you're giving us, and it aligns with best practices for all of these things. I do think we owe you some more detail about how the child care bonus might work. In my opinion, you'd be so lucky to get that application. I think it'd be really unlikely for it to occur, but it's at the table, yeah.
Yes, Commissioner Polgar, please.
I really appreciated some of the comments about the 20% versus 15%. I'm torn. I don't want to I don't want us to have a percentage that's tenable, can't be met. But on the other hand, I feel like the 15%, to a certain extent, it's the same whether it's 20 or 15% for the small projects, which are likely the ones where I would think it would be the hardest to overcome that barrier. So we're not necessarily making, the difference between 15 and 20% is not what's like that's not helping a smaller developer trying to do but when you get 20% on 100 units or whatever, that's a big deal versus 15%. So that I would rather see us not go away from the 20%. For that reason, because I feel like at the lower level of development, that's not a big difference for what we're getting.
And as long as you've brought us back to market rate, for which I thank you, because I was going to shrug and say I forgot. But in that section, we were talking about these thresholds, and I appreciated the comments about focusing things in these low and very low categories the way you have. Part of me actually wishes that we could make them even more so, that we could stagger them even a bit more, because I feel like, I don't feel like I have the data to support it, but I suspect you do, to say that maybe our market demand speaks even more to low and less to moderate in the ownership, and even more to very low and less to low in the rental area. But and if state law doesn't allow us that flexibility, I understand that. But if it does, and if we haven't gotten it, maybe that's part of the reason why, is that we haven't, the agencies that would want to help us, that would lend for that, the things we've heard in the Housing Coalition conversations, maybe they're looking for those sweet spots. And if they were going to be there long-term rather than, really long-term rather than 30 years, then maybe that would be a win. Bear with me a moment.
Commissioner Benjamin, if I could respond on one comment you made earlier, perhaps while you're looking at your notes.
I'll try. I don't multitask well, but go ahead.
All three of you had made comments about the need to sort of back solve for the density issue. And I wanted to just make one point clear. What has typically happened in the city thus far is that instead of actually building BMR units under the code, they pay money. And so we aren't seeing, Jill informed me that we have not seen density bonuses being requested or sought after in the city. And so I just want to make sure that we're not anticipating that every site moving forward is going to have a 35% density increase because of the density bonus ordinance. That's simply not what's happening on the ground. And so just as you have those further conversations around density in the plan moving forward, just be aware that the picture is not quite as the way we discussed.
That, you really made me feel good because I remembered what I was thinking and I acknowledge your comment. It reminds me of the conversations we have had about in lieu fees for parks over the 28 years that I've been here, where we've, gradually gotten park money but haven't spent it. And of course, it has been consumed by inflation. And I would imagine that we have suffered a similar fate. So to the extent that there are ways that we can actually get it. I seem to remember Turner bringing, there was actually development out of, was it earlier Carnoustie or was it an Ocean Colony, where we actually got some rentals that were over near original, South Wavecrest, I think it was. So I know that it has happened, but I agree it has not happened often enough. And good use, good allocation. And may I just say for the record that I would be floored if we were not achieving our above moderate income numbers. I mean, it's not just that we've zoned for it, so Rena's happy because there aren't roadblocks to mega mansions. It is that they actually say, you have to have built this many, and how does that interact with like coastal access? And help me understand how that's
This is a
not
much
incredible.
larger conversation around how HCD is requiring the city to report its units. It's not just zoning for it. That's in the housing element. You have to make sure you have sites that are sufficiently zoned, and tracking the production of affordable housing, including moderate and above moderate. It is based on either a building permit being pulled or a certificate of occupancy. And sorry, I should say, prior to this recent iteration of the report, the city had been doing it based on certificates of occupancy. And the most recent report that was submitted to HCD changed its submittal formats and required it to be switched to building permits. As a result, there's a potential, perhaps even a likely potential, that the city has not been able to report to HCD a certain number of units that are caught in between those two things. We went from reporting earlier in the cycle or later in the cycle to earlier in the cycle, and consequently there are some that are stuck there. Right now, where we are for 2018, we're 4 years into our housing cycle, so the pro rata share that we're requiring to have met is 66? 61. So we have to get to 121 above moderate, and so we're at 61. And the city has only produced 46 by the new accounting. We think that actually maybe more than that, but we're not quite there yet.
It's more by the old method.
Yeah, more by the old method. So that was a longer explanation than
Okay,
what you wanted.
It was clear, and if you heard that sound, there's sound of my brain exploding.
Well, and that's why Sarah and I are going to go to Sacramento and meet with HCD.
If we haven't done enough of that housing, then there's something wrong with the way it's being considered up there, in my opinion. And I remembered, just to clear, the whole conversation about Wavecrest, hearing Mike talk about that reminded me that back in the day there was a proposal for some pretty intense development in that area. And some of the beneficial projects that were going to occur in that area, the project had gotten pretty far down the rails, and then suddenly some of that turned out to be in wetlands that weren't previously acknowledged. And that's an example of the kind of thing that can go wrong if there's not some way to track the effective implementation and maintenance. The affordable housing component shouldn't be on a bluff top that's going to get washed away during the lifetime of the project, that sort of thing. Okay, I think I've beaten this to death. Anybody else want to take it? Yeah. Okay, it is now 10:11. Do you guys feel like you've got the brain to continue with this for a while?
Jill's sections are important, but less cerebral, so hopefully.
Meaning no disrespect. She meant that in the nicest possible way.
I did.
Carry on.
All right, so I'm going to recommend that you let me drone, not very long, but do the whole thing, because we're going to talk about mixed-use zoning, the R2, R3, and parking requirements, and there's a lot of interlacing. Attachment 3 in your packet had a summary table highlighting some of the key points of what we're trying to accomplish here. Starting out with parking in the mixed-use districts and thinking about parking for multifamily and mixed-use development. Noting that multifamily development is not allowed in the commercial visitor serving district. We are not proposing to change that. The purpose of that district is just like its name. It does allow for some some mixed use, and it allows one single family home in certain circumstances, but it is not a place for multifamily. The rest of your mixed use districts, the commercial downtown and the commercial residential, is really the heart of your downtown. And the general commercial, you'll find that zone where your shopping centers are around Highway 1 and 92. All three of those districts allow multifamily. They also allow mixed use. So let's dig in here, whoops, a little bit. So this is one of the things that we hear about a lot from applicants. They really struggle with even some of these little infill projects that you're seeing. The current code requires 2 garage spaces per residential unit, regardless of the size of the unit or the context of the project where it's located. And the number of spaces is as challenging for them as the physical form of providing actual garages or some kind of a parking structure for it, and not allowing more flexibility with regards to some more kind of free-form open space parking areas. Also 1 guest space per 4 units. There are no discounts for mixed use. That's pretty unusual. Most codes allow that. And then the typical ratio for most of your commercial uses is 1 space per 250 square feet. We're talking about retail, office, medical office, et cetera. Restaurants are a little bit different, and I'm not going to focus on them tonight because I think we'll go a little bit too sideways on that. So what we looked at is what a bunch of other cities have done and our own experience and what you have approved or other forms of the Planning Commission have approved for parking exceptions. And we'll show you some of those in a second. Also noting, being very, very mindful that we do not have transit here. We can't pick a parking ratio that a town over the hill is using successfully when they have a BART station or a Caltrain station or some fabulous bus transportation. We get it. You don't have it here. We're not planning to have it here, in fact, other than maybe some shuttles and the like. So we need to be careful and cautious about this. At the same time, we are trying to facilitate housing development, and we're not trying to spend all the developers' money building parking and not having any housing units out of it. That is not going to enliven your downtown. And there's a lot of other components to it. So this is a first start of a proposal for you to noodle about. Taking away just the physical form of the garage and being really open-minded about each site and how it might lay out. We're not doing underground parking in Half Moon Bay. We don't have densities high enough to pay for it. I don't think you're going to see very much of it for the life of any plan that we have coming through on the books or the densities that are in place now or proposed. So we're really looking at tuck-under parking or some surface parking. Maybe someday we'll get to parking lifts. We're seeing those on some tight little infill sites. For example, in San Carlos, there's some very clever ones. Of course, they have an alley. Alleys are fabulous. We don't have alleys. It's really...
Not anymore.
It's really... That hurts me. Don't tell me about it. It makes it so hard to make these work. So We're proposing one space per studio or one-bedroom unit, a space and a half for a two-bedroom or larger, keeping the guest space requirement, and there's a bunch of reasons why, and I won't go there. A discount for mixed use of 25%, and we'll have to talk about the caveats around that because it doesn't work for every mix of uses. If you only have one unit or if you only have a teeny tiny office, they're not producing parking that can be shared, or if the uses aren't compatible. We also need to look at that. Also a slight reduction in how much parking would be needed for some of those commercial uses, especially in the downtown area. A ratio of one space per 300 square feet works pretty well. And a lot of us back at the shop have experience with ratios like that. We're going to look at 3 case studies really quickly on what, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of them I really don't have any other than this one that's actually built and being occupied, and it's parked well as far as we can tell. This is on Mill Street. It's 2 units. These are all very round numbers. I didn't want to pin into each project too deeply. It's about 1,600 square feet of office. It happens to be a dentist office at this time. The column with the 11 total, that's what our code would require now for that development. We can't exactly tell what kind of parking exception was granted for this. This is an older project, and I actually don't know if your parking code was different then, but there was a parking exception associated with the residential part. And the project has 8 spaces. The proposal that we're looking at would require 7, so it's a little bit leaner on this particular proposal. What we've noticed, though, by going to that site several times at different times of day is there's always open parking in that lot, even when the dentist office is open. And it seems like it's working fine. So it's an interesting one. Next is this is a project that was approved in 2017. It's Commissioner Benjamin and Commissioner Hernandez. You were both on the commission when this went through. This is the 700 block of Main Street. This project had it all. It had historic resources. It had a lot merger. We had a shared parking relationship, and it actually made for very good findings for granting a parking exception, so that was helpful. The new building is almost complete. It has 2 units and a ground floor of around 700 square feet of retail. The office space in the existing building is shown around 2,000 square feet. It would have needed 21 parking spaces under our current code. It was approved with 12. The proposal, this first draft of what we might want to look at comes out to be 13, so it's quite similar to the order of magnitude of an exception that you were fairly comfortable with. Now, that said, this had historic resources, and that's a reason for perhaps digging deeper than you might on other sites that are fresh and you don't have that kind of constraint. And the third one you saw recently, this is the Bike Works project, so it also had it all because it had a historic building, and it had the appeal of a bike shop being one that is going to be a little more oriented towards having bicycle mode being used. But that said, you were approving a retail use and not necessarily a bike shop, so it's more about the land use. There were a lot of different ways to figure out how many parking spaces that project needed because there's a lot of caveats about our code with regards to changing existing uses to new uses. I took something very, the simplest way, and it was 33 spaces. It was approved with 19. This method that we're kind of noodling on comes up with 21. We note that their site plan had room for 3 more spaces, and if they have issues with parking, they could be utilized, but the commission was really liking the way that the site laid out, and the open space in particular was really nicely done on that property with plazas and forecourts and things like that. So but you can see this is sort of in the ballpark of what you've been considering, and I will be happy to go and try to find a few more, but this was just to get the conversation started. Things that need to be worked through for shared parking in particular, is the discount going to be okay, and if yes, where? In this case, I'm going to make a few suggestions. They're not strong recommendations, but we wouldn't want to see a mixed-use discount in the commercial visitor serving area. Those sites are, they're at the north and south end of town. They do not have street side parking. They do not have a mixed-use neighborhood about them. They're one-off, isolated, kind of what we would call a pod site. They're on their own. They don't have any way to overflow. In the commercial residential, the commercial downtown, you've got a nice small block grid, lots of street side parking. It can be accommodated more gracefully if there's a phase where there isn't enough parking for like maybe the retail use peaks when everybody comes home at the same time. Excuse me. The other trick is about reserving for the residences. That was a conversation you had about the 700 block of Main Street project. It is kind of nice to have one space per unit that you know is always going to be there for you, but if it diminishes the pool of shared parking that the commercial and the residential use can use, it doesn't support what you're trying to do. So there needs to be, and this is something I've seen in codes, some thresholds about having, you need at least like 50% of the total that you would normally require should be in a shared pool, things like that, to have a floor for it. Deeper reductions for special needs populations. This pokes back into the density bonus code, and we would absolutely encourage this, but you have to be careful that the use will maintain the special needs population. So that's important. This is a chance to revisit other kinds of parking. The city has pretty good code about bicycle parking, both short-term and long-term, so racks and lockers or wherever else it might be kept. We don't have any code around EV other than the building code, which requires EV for residential. You've been getting EV chargers for some of your projects when they make sense, but this is an opportunity to think about that. Now that said, if you put an EV charger in the shared pool, that space is going to be limited to those who have the card that can use it. So it's it's cuts both ways. Really, really, really important when we're thinking about trimming parking requirements is to consider how storage space is addressed in residential units. If it's not provided and there's a garage space, the garage is going to be filled up with storage. It's just, it's normal. I speak from the truth of my own garage. And it's tough to plan this stuff in, and so we want it codified so that the architect knows when they're starting out this is expected. And usually the storage space is defined as being big enough for is it big enough for 2 bikes, for example, is one way to plan that out. So those are a few things, and then we also want to see how it would cross into the density bonus parking concessions. And we've got more work to do on that, but I just wanted to give you some thinking there. All right, the rest of this is quicker. Oh, and by the way, sorry. This approach could also work for single-use multifamily. There would be no discount. There would be no commercial shared pool. The idea would just be a modestly lower ratio for the residential units, still requiring the guest parking on site, which would help pick up a little bit of the slack and provide for a couple open stalls, for example, so that you could still have some flexibility there. So we should find a couple projects for you that are just single-use multifamily.
If I could interrupt for a moment, we're
do they
approaching the
have to-
10:30.
Read my
time.
mind. Commissioners, if your brain is still functioning, you want to, the public is still here, so I want to give them a chance to speak. How long would you like to continue? Let's have a motion.
Half hour?
My brain will be gravy in half an hour, no more than that.
How much time do you need? 15 minutes?
No, let's go a half hour.
Okay, I'll make a motion to continue to 11.
Is there a second?
I second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. I don't know if we lost Rick.
All right, our deputy city attorney is going to time me and make me keep going. So, mixed-use districts, in particular, your commercial downtown district, I'm frankly concerned about a few things that are very hard on making residential work in a mixed-use zoning district. And it is a conundrum because the purpose of the mixed-use zoning district is to have a mix of uses, including residential, and the residential should be principally permitted. It is not. We require a use permit for every residential unit that comes into the commercial downtown district. Oh,
Sorry.
okay. And that is why we had that fun use permit hearing for somebody to use the house as a house. And we would also like you to think about conversions of existing space that is for non-priority uses, so an office, this is typical, an upstairs office where they want to convert it to a couple units. Right now, we would require a use permit to do that. The office is probably going to require more parking or similar amounts of parking as the residential use. If it has non-conforming parking, it would probably end up having about the same level of non-conformance in parking. If it's on a water connection appropriate for the non-priority use, that should still be okay as well. Yes, it's maybe a change of intensity of use, the definition of development, but not significantly, and it would be one where we would really be looking for how to get rid of that use permit requirement and have you entertain a waiver or some kind of exemption for, at least for small scale conversions. They could be done very quickly. They'd save a lot of money, and nobody even knows they're happening. They're very nice. Okay. Then this is really interesting for your main street between Pilarcitos Creek and Correa Street. It's becoming clear that we've got a pretty big hole in the code, and the code is quite permissive for, this isn't straight up about housing. The code is very permissive with respect to ground floor uses. Most towns' codes for their, what I've heard called the 4 magic blocks, would not allow office uses on the ground floor. If they do allow office uses, they usually have a whole bunch of rules around them that they are what we would call ground floor dependent, meaning they actually do a lot of foot traffic. City Hall is borderline being ground floor dependent. We're so friendly that there's people in this room who come in and visit us on a regular basis, but for business, but it's still, we shouldn't probably be there. Let's be clear about that. So we're concerned, and we're going to show you some changes for that ground floor. We also don't want residential on the ground floor between those blocks. You could have a door on the street, and you have buildings that are like this that lead to the second floor. That's fine. And you need to have some code about maintaining a storefront that is the dominant feature of the building form, and the entrance to the upstairs portion is subordinate to that. And it can work really quite beautifully in terms of the urban form. Very concerned also about some old choices that were made about curb cuts on Main Street and where parking lots are between buildings and the sidewalk. I don't think we're doing that anymore, but the code isn't very firm about that. So wrapping the corner is a big deal, and storefront and entrance. Let's pick on City Hall because we don't want to pick on anybody else. City Hall is actually really great in terms of holding the corner. That's what we're talking about there. If we get a new corner building on a 100-foot deep lot, you don't want it to be 20 feet deep. You need it to move around the corner. It's really important in your downtown. Recessed entrance, all those windows. We're talking about just little tweaks of form-based code, but there we are. We've got a curb cut that drives, you can drive right over the sidewalk where somebody's walking their dog, and we've got a parking lot visible from the street. Those are not the ideal form. So those are some things we just like to put a few tweaks in to enhance the mixed use environment and the neighborhood comfort level of what we're trying to do. 3 minutes. R2, R3. City has very little of this kind of zoning. There's 2 R3 districts. I think in the staff report I said there was 1. There's actually 2. There's this guy down here. And then here's your R2 area, and that's it. Right now, the code, I don't know why, it was amended not that long ago to allow single family as a permitted use. The developer is always going to pick the house. It's easier to build, it's easier to sell, and they will make more money. We are going to suggest a conditional use for single family on these lots with the ability to grant it a use. Here's a place where we want that development form to be a conditional use. What if the lot is impacted by ESHA? Well, then we don't want to force the duplex or the triplex. We're okay probably with the cottage. We'd like to clarify parking. There's some confusion in that code about parking, and also a few development standards. Just a little tweak to allow a duplex form to have a little bit bigger footprint and a little bit larger floor area ratio than single family. And for the R3, I don't understand this, and I wasn't, maybe you guys know, why does it have a 40-foot height limit? It's really tall, and I would recommend going down to 36 or maybe lower to allow the 3-story building, but there's no need to be higher than that, and we can take a look at what's out there. But that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. I'll let the record show that we lost Commissioner Hernandez, sadly. And so I think one of the things we need to do is to be sure to give him an opportunity to put his 2 cents into the process, even though we don't have him. Given the late hour, I'm thinking we all may want to have another look at this as well. But I'd love to get your comments tonight, clarifying questions, and then hear from the public before we opine. Any clarifying questions? That would be a no. Public?
A lot of the parking discussion was very interesting, and we've been allowing kind of a mix over the years. The affordable housing from the South Wavecrest project is actually garages, enclosed garages, the nicest affordable housing project anywhere. Moonridge, though, has constrained parking. The idea was that those folks that would live there wouldn't need many vehicles. Got to take a look at Miramontes Point Road sometime. All right. There's fairly ample parking in South Main Street, and they have covered parking, which is nice. But you see South Main Street being taken up by parking. in the evenings and weekends. So I guess what I'm working up to is take Palo Alto, for instance, which is about 5 times bigger than Half Moon Bay. But they had a terrible parking problem in downtown Palo Alto, where you have the old residences, but you also had business offices being built up and a lot of retail and restaurants. And they had parking garages. Okay? And still, people that lived downtown couldn't park in front of their own house or have a guest park in front of their own house. So it got to be a big issue. And Eric Filseth, the councilman, took it on himself to go out and put together a parking program that has been a great success and has gone a long way toward resolving a lot of that angst. He also incidentally was reelected in a landslide. Okay, so that was a popular thing that he did. But I'm just trying to say that as we relax parking, as there's pressure from the state to do that or to get our density, I think we really need to be looking at parking programs, especially downtown, if we're going to go for density. Thank you.
Thank you. Any, yes. The record should show that was Mr. Ferrer, and now we're going to hear from Mr. Jameson.
Jill, can you go back to that last slide that shows the R3 locations? Okay, so my only thought regarding the height limitation is the lower section that's R3 over here, that one day that could be redeveloped potentially. And the only potential benefit of allowing the 40 feet is if you were going to put parking on the lowest level and then have the next 3 floors for the units themselves. So just to keep that in mind, that might be the one reason you might allow it.
Thank you. All right. I'm now going to close the public hearing on this item and bring it back to the commission for your thoughts. Who would like to speak? I will. Okay, Commissioner Polgar, go for it.
Well, I certainly appreciated the changes, for instance, to the use permit, requiring the use permit, that I'm in favor of all of that. I also was very pleased to see the ground floor protections for the commercial downtown. I think that's really important for preserving what we want on Main Street, for instance. And what else? I think I appreciate your case studies of the parking, because it does make it clear that what we're kind of approving is, you know, very similar. I'm maybe not understanding how it would apply it, like a single, you said single use, and so maybe it'd be good to just have that as an example. It's also like my brain has gone down the rabbit hole long ago, so I probably will have more thoughts, and maybe I can share those, or I don't know if there's a way that so the public can also hear it, but right now I think I'll leave it at that.
That would probably be continuing the item. We'll see. Commissioner Reddick.
Well, I think the direction that you're headed in makes a lot of sense. I think that to some extent, when we look at those case studies and some of the recent exceptions, it feels like, you know, we've been evolving the parking requirements sort of organically, and maybe that indicates that the existing requirements are a bit obsolete and don't take into account the realities of life in Half Moon Bay and the Bay Area right now. I'm not ready to nitpick on any of the details of any of those things, but I support that direction.
So I am ready to nitpick on some details, but it's late, and I'd rather do it when we're all fully focused. A couple of high points. I drove around this afternoon to all of our R3 areas, and what I noticed was, as Mr. Ferreira mentioned, Miramontes Point Road, where in the vicinity of Moon Ridge, was saturated with automobiles on the street and empty in the parking areas. Similar experience, well, in some places where there's covered parking, closed garages, I couldn't tell, but it was saturated. My hypothesis in those areas, similar to Main Street, is that what we have are at least 2 cars, possibly more cars per unit. And so when we do our mathematics about how much parking is required, I want to be, I don't think that there's any attempt to be magical in our thinking about this, but I want to be sure that we don't stray into magical thinking about how much parking we actually need. Because my impression is, unless we go through a significant change in the use of the automobile, we are going to continue to have this demand. With respect to relaxing coastal development permit requirements, I wish I could agree. I feel like this is one of those examples where we have to recognize what our laws say. It does represent a change in use, especially if it changes the amount of automobile traffic. I feel like it's, the coastal development permit is a trigger in what otherwise could become exempt from consideration. So I'm reluctant to go forward with the local coastal program coastal development permit release. The use permit, in some cases, is the only reason we get to a coastal development permit. And so I'd like to think more about that. There may be times where it might work, but there may be times where we don't. So I don't want to dwell on that detail yet. I still need to think about it. As the community development director mentioned, the restaurant case is a squirrely one, and we ought to spend time when we're all wide awake and very focused to understand the ramifications of that. I support the idea of a parking permit program. We actually have a couple of issues here. One of them is, as the public mentioned, finding a way to accommodate a place where people who live in the area can park near their homes. But in the downtown, the time they need to park in their homes may very well be the time that restaurants and other public services need access to those spots. And if it's a higher density area, to return to the subject of affordable housing, we could be talking about a lot of cars. So I worry about the ramifications of that. And the city has gone through an iteration of how parking programs can work in the coastal zone and what it means to provide public access. In the downtown, it might not be an issue, but to the extent that we end up having very affordable parking in areas that are closer to the coast, it could become an issue. So I think if I were to try to bubble all that minutia up, it feels like I wish that I could come across a brass lamp and a genie would appear to the Planning Commission, and we could wish for a parking structure. That's what we need. A place where we can say, this is a place to park, whether you're a visitor coming in for the day or you're a resident and you need to stay away from where our visitors want to go to dinner or whatever. And just as we have accrued money for low affordable housing and as we have accrued money for parks, I wish that we could accrue money for a parking structure. I feel like that would be a benefit. I realize it's a lot of money. I realize it probably doesn't go underground, but there's no law against wishing. So I have other thoughts, but I think my brain is tired, and I want staff to have a chance to respond to what they heard. And I hope you'll agree with me that we ought to give Commissioner Hernandez and our more refreshed brains a chance to continue this conversation.
Of course. So I will reach out to both Commissioner Holt and Chair Holt and Commissioner Hernandez on this. Before I cover the next steps, just want to note something that we think is really important to do if we are going to consider reducing parking requirements is to really put some walls around parking exceptions. So we've already drafted some new findings about them. There's a finding right now about the applicant did everything they possibly could. It's an impossible to make finding. You've made it before, but I mean, it's really, I don't know how to test that one. We're suggesting that you think about putting a cap on what you could ever accept if the ratios were reduced like 10%, maintain a finding about historic resources, and add a finding in anticipation of having a parking facility for parking in lieu fee to be a way to buy out of your parking spaces. And there's a few steps to go, but that goes right where you're talking about having a structure that's shared and really useful. So next steps, what we see here is probably separating these into 2 tracks. The below market rate and density bonus work can be codified pretty quickly. Some of it's prescriptive. You gave us a lot of specific direction, and we would come back in a study session format with a draft ordinance, giving your colleagues, of course, time and the public time to comment on it, and then move you into a hearing and then get it up to City Council. For these more kind of planny, land use-y things, I'd like to do something similar but separate the meetings, because obviously this is really content-rich and we're going to need to spend a bit of time with it. We also need to do some outreach. This affects property owners doing things right now with their buildings downtown. So it's a lot more sensitive to your local business community and landlords, property owners. So we'll do that. And for both of these tracks, we will be talking to our Coastal Commission colleagues and make sure that they're able to give us some direction if they feel that we need it. And we'll go from there. Honestly, the code is pretty easy to write. We've already done a version of it just to see how it works, and that's kind of how you go backwards. That's how you get to a study session. And so we don't want to surprise you that we can go pretty quickly with especially the top one there. So we appreciate your input tonight on these. Appreciate the cautions, and I understand them. And thank you for staying late. That's all we have on this item. I have a really brief director's report if you want that.
Before we depart, I probably should have mentioned all of the things we said about back solving for density applies at least as much with respect to parking. So let's not lose. If we're going to separate these tracks, let's make sure we keep a bridge to remember that, because they seem quite related. If there are no other comments from my colleagues, okay, we'll close this item, or sorry, do we need a motion to continue? I guess it's a study session, so we'll just continue to we'll have a study session more. So we're done with this item for now. Okay, good. So on with the director's report.
All right, just the key item here is we're going to see you again in a week, and you're going to get a late packet, and there won't be very much in it. We're going to have the Public Works chapter for you on Tuesday night, and we'll give you a presentation of what's in that chapter. That is the last missing piece of your draft land use plan at this phase. We'll lay out a schedule of how we would like to move forward, and set up a community kind of closed time for this draft for comments, so that we can assemble all of those, bring them back to the subcommittee, and bring you an updated draft. So if you have comments that you've been thinking about in your review of the document that haven't come out in the discussions, try to do some of that next week, or come and meet with staff. Brittany and I can meet with you and we can go through it. So we'll talk to you more about it and make sure you have enough time to get everything out that you want out. You have a big August, whoops, I didn't even ask you. I assume you are all going to be there next week. We believe Rick will be there. We believe Chair Holt will be there. So we have a full commission. Excellent. Thank you. No August 13th meeting. August 27th, we just put the bicycle pedestrian master plan initial study, mitigated neg deck, out for circulation. If you would like a hard copy of that document or of the bicycle and pedestrian master plan, let us know and we'll prepare those for you. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and send you links to these documents probably within a week. So I'll try to remember to send you an email. Quite a bit more going on in September. We have you with full agendas through all of October and already looking at November. So you're just a really busy commission. The Pillar Point RV Park appeal period ended today, and so the notice of final action will be going up to the Coastal Commission. And since you saw that project, we submitted an application for a priority conservation area grant. We just thought you'd want to know that everything that was going on in the room where people said try to get the money, we're trying to do that. There was a very detailed affordable housing study session on July 16th, 1 week ago with City Council. This zoning work was presented to them at a much more general level. They were quite generally supportive. If you're interested in hearing their discussion about it, of course you can watch that. I think I sent you a link to the staff report because a lot of work went into that, and we just thought it would be a good resource document for you. August 20th, the City Council will probably be taking up the Architectural Advisory Committee appointments, and that's all I've got.
Thank you. Any questions? Planning Commission communications. Going once, going twice. Motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
I'll second.
It is unanimous. Thank you and good night. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Greg.